Hello everyone, I'm the Creeps Cabin. I know you use these videos to fall asleep. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. It started as a simple plan, nothing dramatic. I had been feeling restless for weeks, buried under work and routine. So when I got a weekend off, I decided to get out of the city and spend a couple of days somewhere quiet. I found a small, rundown cabin listed online, tucked deep in the countryside and far from anything busy. The pictures showed peeling paint, an overgrown yard, and a small creek running at the edge of the property. It wasn't pretty, but that was the point. I didn't want charm or tourist appeal. I wanted silence. The idea of sitting on a porch with nothing but the sound of wind and water appealed to me. The drive out there took almost 4 hours. The last stretch was just dirt roads and scattered farms. The air felt different, heavy with the scent of damp earth and grass. It had rained earlier that morning, so the road was soft, the car slipping slightly in the mud in some parts. I saw fewer and fewer houses until there were none at all, just rolling hills, patches of trees, and fences marking forgotten boundaries. Eventually, the GPS lost signal, and I had to rely on the written directions I'd printed out before leaving. The last turn was onto a narrow path between tall weeds, the ground uneven and wet. It scraped the bottom of my car more than once before opening into a small clearing. The cabin stood in the center of it, weathered wood darkened by age and rain, the windows streaked and dull. The yard was wild, grass waist-high in some areas, thickets of weeds around the edges. The only sound was the creek somewhere beyond the trees. There was no sign of anyone else for miles. I killed the engine and sat there for a moment, letting the quiet settle around me. Inside, the cabin was exactly what I expected: dust, cobwebs in corners, and the faint smell of damp wood. The furniture was mismatched and old. A couple of chairs with sunken cushions, a table scarred from years of use, and a narrow bed in the single bedroom. There was no electricity and no running water inside, just a hand pump outside near the creek for drawing water. It felt like stepping back decades in time. I unpacked what I needed, lit a couple of candles, and opened the windows to let fresh air push out the mustiness. The first few hours passed quietly. I walked the property, following the creek until it wound back into dense trees, the water moving slowly over smooth stones. The ground was soft from the rain, my shoes leaving deep prints. I noticed animal tracks here and there, deer mostly, some smaller ones I couldn't identify. As the sun dipped lower, the air grew cooler. By the time I made it back to the cabin, shadows had stretched long over the clearing. That night, I built a small fire in the stone pit outside and sat there for hours, watching the flames. The dark here felt different than in the city. It wasn't just the absence of light, it was thicker, heavier, pressing in on all sides. Every small sound stood out: the crack of branches in the distance, the occasional splash in the creek, the faint rustle of grass as something moved through it. I couldn't see far beyond the firelight, and that alone made me feel exposed. By midnight, the cold had crept in enough that I put the fire out and went inside. The cabin was colder than I expected. I crawled into bed fully dressed, listening to the faint creak of the old walls in the wind. At some point in the night, I woke up to a noise, dull and heavy, like something thudding against the wall outside. I lay still listening. It came again, irregular, sometimes soft, sometimes louder. I told myself it was probably a branch knocking in the wind, but the sound was too low for that, too deliberate. I stayed awake until it faded, not sure when I finally drifted back to sleep. The next morning was gray, the sky thick with clouds. The air smelled sharp and wet, promising more rain. I stepped outside and circled the cabin, looking for the source of the sound from the night before. Near the back wall, the ground was freshly disturbed, mud churned and flattened, like something had been there for a while. There were prints too, not clear enough to make out exactly, but larger than my own foot. I crouched down, touching the wet earth. Whatever made them had been heavy. I told myself it was probably just a deer, maybe rooting around for food. I tried not to think too much about it, but the unease lingered. I spent most of the day indoors, reading, cooking over the small camp stove I'd brought, and trying to ignore the strange feeling of being watched whenever I stepped outside. The woods around the clearing looked thicker than they had the day before, the tree line darker, like it held something inside. That evening, I decided to walk to the creek again. The light was dim, the water darker under the shadow of the trees. The air was completely still. No wind, no rustling leaves, no bird calls. I stood there for a while, looking into the water, and noticed movement on the opposite bank. It was quick, low to the ground, slipping between the undergrowth. I couldn't see clearly, just a shape, but it moved with purpose, not like an animal foraging. I watched until it vanished deeper into the trees. On the walk back, I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling like something was behind me. My pace quickened, my heartbeat matching it. The clearing felt like safety when I finally saw it, but the cabin didn't feel as comforting as it had before. That night, the noise returned, closer this time. It wasn't just a thud against the wall now. There were soft, dragging sounds, like something moving slowly around the cabin. The wood creaked under weight near the porch. I lay still in bed, my breathing shallow, the blankets pulled up to my chin. Every instinct told me not to move, not to make a sound. After what felt like hours, it went quiet again, but I didn't sleep. By morning, I was exhausted. I walked the perimeter again and found more disturbed ground. Mud pressed down in wide, uneven shapes. The grass was bent in a trail leading toward the trees, but it stopped abruptly, as if whatever had made it had stepped off deliberately to hide its path. I decided I would leave early the next morning. The trip had stopped feeling like an escape and started feeling like something else entirely, like I was waiting for something I didn't want to meet. That evening, I didn't go outside at all. I locked the door, such as it was, and sat at the table with a candle burning, listening. The first sound was faint, a light scrape along the wall. Then another, closer to the window. The glass rattled softly, like it was being tested. My mouth went dry, my pulse hammering in my ears. The candle flame trembled in the draft. I sat there, unmoving, every muscle tense, listening to the slow, deliberate movement outside. When it reached the door, I felt the wood shift under a push. The latch held, but only barely. It wasn't built for strength. There was no knock, no voice, just the pressure, then a long pause. My hands were shaking. After a while, the weight lifted, and I heard slow steps moving away into the grass. I didn't move until the first pale light of dawn crept through the window. I packed quickly, my hands clumsy from lack of sleep. Outside, the yard was damp with dew, the grass shining in the low light. Near the edge of the clearing, I saw it, prints in the mud deep and wide, leading toward the trees. They weren't the neat, even marks of an animal. The stride was long, the shape irregular, like a bare foot, but wrong somehow, the toes spread too far apart. I didn't follow them. I didn't look toward the trees. I loaded my things into the car, started the engine, and drove until the dirt road turned back to pavement, and the trees thinned into open land. I didn't stop until I reached the first small town miles away. Even now, I think about those prints, about the quiet steps in the grass, and the weight against the door. I tell myself it was just a person, someone passing through the woods who decided to test the cabin out of curiosity. But the shape of those tracks and the deliberate way they moved around the clearing still sit in the back of my mind. I didn't see their face, didn't hear a single word, and maybe that's why it unsettles me so deeply. Because whatever it was, it never needed to be seen or heard to make its presence known. And I know, without a doubt, that if I had stayed one more night, the door wouldn't have been enough to keep it out. I had been looking forward to the trip for weeks. It wasn't anything extravagant, just a few days away from everything, tucked somewhere quiet, away from the constant noise of town. I packed the back of my car with everything I thought I might need: tent, sleeping bag, small stove, food, flashlight, spare clothes, and enough water to last me comfortably. I had chosen a spot I'd seen on a hiking map, a small patch of clearing deep within a stretch of woods that, according to the map, was rarely visited. That was exactly what I wanted. No crowds, no interruptions, just the sound of the wind moving through the trees. The drive out there took longer than I thought. The paved road gave way to gravel, then narrowed into something that felt more like a dirt track than an actual road. Every bump and dip shook the gear in the back, and I had to slow down to keep from damaging my car. Eventually, I reached a small turnout where the map had indicated the start of the trail. The air smelled cleaner here, like damp leaves and soil that had been turned over by the rain earlier in the week. I parked the car, slung my backpack over my shoulders, and started walking. The trail was narrow, lined with uneven roots and patches of moss. The trees closed in quickly, blocking much of the sky. The sound of the outside world faded until it was just the crunch of my boots on the ground and the distant calls of unseen birds. I kept walking until the path began to fade, replaced by faint impressions of where others had stepped before me. I had to check my compass twice to make sure I was still heading in the right direction. After about an hour, I found the clearing. It wasn't large, just a patch of grass ringed by tall pines and maples, but it was enough for my tent and a small fire. I set my bag down and stood for a moment, letting my eyes sweep the tree line. Nothing moved except for a few drifting leaves. I began setting up camp, staking the tent, and arranging my gear inside. The silence here was heavier than I expected. Even when I stopped moving, the forest seemed to hold its breath. By late afternoon, the temperature began to drop. The sun filtered through the trees in narrow, golden beams, casting long shadows that stretched across the clearing. I gathered some fallen branches and dry twigs for a fire. The ground was soft and damp in places, and I had to watch my step to keep from twisting my ankle. When the fire was going, I sat beside it and made a simple meal. Eating alone in the woods always felt different. It made me notice every tiny sound in the darkness beyond the glow of the flames. A faint rustle here, a snapping twig there. I told myself it was just small animals moving around. That was normal. Night settled in faster than I expected. The darkness here was complete, as if the trees had swallowed the last scraps of daylight. The firelight reached only so far, and beyond that was an endless black wall. I adjusted my lantern so it lit the tent interior, then sat back outside, watching the flames and listening. It must have been close to midnight when I first heard it. A steady, deliberate crunching sound, like boots pressing into damp ground. It came from somewhere beyond the tree line to my left. I froze, my hands still resting on my knees. I strained my ears, trying to tell if it was just my imagination, but the sound continued, slow, even steps. The fire popped, masking the noise for a moment, but then it came again. My first thought was that maybe another hiker had wandered too far and was looking for a place to stop. But there was no light, no voice calling out, no sign of another person except for those measured steps. I leaned slightly forward, my eyes scanning the darkness between the trees. The sound stopped. Just like that. One moment it was there, the next it was gone. I stayed perfectly still for several minutes, my ears straining, but all I could hear now was the faint hiss of the fire. Eventually, I told myself it was nothing, maybe a deer passing through, and tried to shake it off. I banked the fire low and crawled into the tent. The air inside was warmer, the faint smell of smoke clinging to my clothes. I slid into my sleeping bag and lay there, staring at the nylon ceiling, listening. Every creak of the forest outside seemed louder now. My heartbeat felt unnaturally loud in my own ears. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke to a sound that instantly tightened every muscle in my body. It was faint, but unmistakable, a long, slow drag of something across the ground, like a heavy stick or a boot sliding through wet leaves. It came from just outside the tent, close enough that I could sense the weight of it. I didn't move. My breathing slowed to quiet, shallow pulls of air. The sound stopped again. Seconds passed, and then I heard it, a soft, deliberate shift, as though someone had shifted their weight from one foot to the other. My skin prickled, and I could feel my pulse hammering in my neck. I waited, but there was nothing more. After what felt like an hour, but was probably only minutes, I reached slowly for the small flashlight beside my sleeping bag. My hand shook as I clicked it on, the weak beam cutting through the tent fabric and spilling a faint glow outside. I didn't see anything through the shadowed shapes of the trees. When morning finally came, it was like a weight lifted. The sky was pale and washed out, but it was light, and that was enough to push away the unease that had settled over me. I stepped out of the tent, scanning the clearing. Nothing seemed disturbed. No footprints, no broken branches, just the same forest I had seen the day before. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I made coffee over the fire, but my eyes kept drifting toward the trees where I thought I had heard the sounds. The forest there was dense, shadows clinging under every branch. I told myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. By midday, I decided I would take a short walk along the edge of the clearing to gather more firewood. I kept my footsteps light, trying to move without snapping any twigs. The ground was uneven, and I found myself stepping over fallen logs and patches of tangled roots. At one point, I stopped, crouching to pick up a thick branch that would burn well, and that's when I noticed it. In the soft patch of soil, just beyond a cluster of ferns, was a single print. It wasn't an animal print, it was the heel and partial tread of a boot. fresh enough that the edges were still sharp. My mouth went dry as I crouched there, staring at it. It wasn't mine. I hadn't been in this part of the clearing before. I looked up into the trees, scanning for movement, but there was nothing. No sound except the distant call of a bird. Slowly, I backed away from the spot, my grip tightening around the stick in my hand. The rest of the day passed slowly. I kept glancing at the tree-line, half expecting to see someone standing there. The forest, which had felt calm and welcoming when I arrived, now felt like it was watching me. That night, I built the fire higher, its light pushing further into the dark. I sat with my back to the tent so nothing could approach from behind without me hearing it. Hours passed without anything happening, but I couldn't relax. I listened to every whisper of the wind, every faint shuffle of leaves. When I finally went inside the tent, I kept the flashlight in my hand. Sleep came in short, shallow bursts. Sometime deep into the night, I woke again, not to a sound, but to the feeling that something was different. The air inside the tent felt colder, and there was a faint shadow moving across the thin fabric wall. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The shadow moved slowly, passing along the length of the tent. I couldn't hear footsteps this time, but the movement was unmistakable. Then it was gone. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn, my ears straining for the slightest sound. When the sun rose, I packed my gear quickly. My plan had been to stay for 3 days, but the thought of another night here made my stomach turn. As I carried my bag back to the trail, I glanced one last time at the clearing. It looked exactly as it had when I arrived, quiet, still untouched. But I knew someone had been there. Someone had walked just beyond my tent in the dark, close enough for me to hear them breathe. I reached my car and loaded everything in, my eyes sweeping the tree line one final time. The forest gave nothing away. It just stood there, silent, as if it had swallowed the truth whole. I started the engine and drove away, and only when the trees began to thin and the road widened did I let out the breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. I didn't go back to that spot again. I told myself it was just a strange encounter, something that could happen anywhere if you were in the wrong place at the wrong time. But even now, years later, when I'm lying awake at night, I still remember the sound, that slow, steady movement just outside my tent, and the knowledge that whoever it was, they had stood there in the dark, completely silent, just watching. It was the kind of day that felt heavier than usual, the air thick even though the sky was clear. I had been driving for most of the afternoon, following winding roads through farmland and patches of woods, until the landscape slowly shifted into deeper forest. The road narrowed, the pavement cracked in places, and the shoulder was barely wide enough for a car to stop. I had no real reason to be here except that I wanted to get away for a while. I'd packed a small bag, some food, and my camera, thinking I might camp for the night somewhere quiet. By late afternoon, I found a pull-off on the side of the road that looked barely used. It was just a small break in the tree line with enough room for one vehicle. Beyond it, a narrow dirt track disappeared into the trees. It didn't look official, no signs, no trespassing markers, nothing. I figured it might lead to an old logging site or an overgrown trail. My curiosity got the better of me. I parked, locked the car, and started walking down the path. The forest felt different the moment I stepped off the road. The trees grew taller, their trunks straight and close together, and the canopy blocked much of the sunlight. The air was cooler here, damp with the smell of soil and leaves. My footsteps crunched lightly on the dirt and fallen twigs, but the sound didn't travel far. It was quiet, so quiet that I could hear the faint ringing in my ears when I stopped moving. The track wound on for maybe a quarter mile before widening into a small clearing. There were old tire ruts in the dirt, long overgrown with weeds. I could tell no one had driven back here in years. The ground was uneven, littered with sticks and small rocks, and in the middle stood the rotting remains of a wooden shed. The walls were warped, the roof sagged in the middle, and one side had collapsed completely, exposing a pile of rusted tools inside. I walked around it, taking a few pictures. The shed didn't seem worth exploring, too unstable. But on the far side of the clearing, I noticed another path, even narrower than the first, disappearing deeper into the woods. Something about it felt different. The dirt was packed smooth, as though it had been walked often, and there were no weeds in the center. It wasn't overgrown like the rest of the area. I followed it. The further I went, the more I felt the trees pressing in. Branches hung low in places, forcing me to duck. I could hear the sound of my own breathing, steady but louder than it should have been. My shirt stuck slightly to my back with sweat, even though the shade kept the air cool. After maybe 10 minutes, I came across something unexpected. A thin wire stretched across the path about knee-high. It was old but not rusted, taut between two trees. I stepped over it carefully, frowning. It didn't seem like a fence, more like a tripwire. But for what? Hunting maybe? Not much farther along, the ground dipped slightly, and I found myself in another clearing. This one smaller and strangely clean. The grass was flattened in the middle, like something heavy had been lying there recently. The dirt was bare in spots, and there were faint marks in it, like dragging lines leading back toward the path I'd just come from. I crouched to look closer. The marks weren't made by tires or boots. They were too irregular, like something had been pulled. My stomach tightened. Without realizing it, I started glancing behind me more often, scanning the trees. Every shadow felt heavier. I kept going, though my pace slowed. The path narrowed further, and the undergrowth grew denser on both sides. I had the sense that if I stepped off it, I'd quickly lose my way. The trees here were older, thicker, their bark deeply grooved and dark. Then I smelled it, a sharp, sour odor, faint but distinct. At first, I thought it might be a dead animal somewhere nearby. I'd smelled that before in the woods, but this was different. It had a chemical edge to it, like metal or something burned. I slowed even more, breathing shallowly through my mouth. The path curved, and suddenly I saw it, a large, rectangular hole in the ground, maybe 10 feet long and 3 feet wide. The dirt around it was fresh, piled in uneven mounds on both sides. It wasn't an old pit. This had been dug recently. The edges were sharp, and the bottom was shadowed. I took a cautious step closer and peered in. The smell was stronger here, curling up from the darkness below. I couldn't see clearly at first, so I crouched. My eyes adjusted, and I saw what looked like a thick black tarp folded loosely at the bottom. But there were shapes under it, lumpy, uneven shapes that didn't match the folds of the material. I stared too long, trying to make sense of it, until a cold prickle ran down my spine. I stood quickly, heart pounding. I didn't want to know more. I turned to leave, but as I stepped back onto the path, I noticed something that froze me in place. My footprints, fresh, obvious in the soft dirt, were the only ones on the path. Except now there was another set. They hadn't been there before. They were faint but clear enough to see. Boot prints, larger than mine, leading in the same direction I'd come from. They stopped maybe 10 feet behind me, facing where I had just been standing. My skin crawled. I looked down the path behind me, but it was empty. The trees swayed slightly in a breeze I couldn't feel. I didn't think. I just started walking, fast but trying not to run. My legs felt heavy, my breath loud in my ears. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone step out from behind a tree. The path seemed longer than before, stretching endlessly, the turn ahead refusing to come. When I finally reached the first clearing with the old shed, I didn't stop. I cut straight across, heading for the wider track that led back to the road. My eyes stayed locked on the path ahead, but I could hear something, soft, steady behind me. Footsteps, almost in time with mine, but stopping when I stopped. By the time I saw my car through the trees, my hands were shaking so badly I fumbled my keys. I didn't look back. I unlocked the door, slid in, and slammed it shut. The air inside was stifling, but I didn't roll down the windows. I started the engine, turned the car around, and drove away, my tires kicking up dust. I didn't slow down until I was miles away, back on a road with houses and driveways. Only then did I let myself breathe fully. But even as I did, I couldn't stop thinking about that pit, the smell, the fresh dirt, and those footprints that hadn't been there before. Someone had been standing behind me in those woods, close enough to watch me, close enough to know I'd seen something I shouldn't have. And I left without knowing if they were still there, or if they had followed me part of the way, watching me leave. For the rest of that night, every time I closed my eyes, I saw the edge of that pit, the dark shapes beneath the tarp, and the empty path stretching out in front of me with the sound of soft, matching footsteps just behind. I know I'll never go back there, but I also know whoever dug that hole is still out there, somewhere, walking quietly in those woods, and I wasn't supposed to find it. It started out as just another afternoon, nothing out of the ordinary. I had been driving for hours, heading back home from visiting an old friend in a small rural town. The main highway had been shut down for some kind of construction work, and my GPS kept insisting that I take a longer route through the back roads. I wasn't a fan of it, but I didn't have much of a choice. The daylight was slowly fading, and I knew I'd be stuck driving in the dark soon. I told myself it wasn't a big deal, but deep down, I already felt a little uneasy. The road wound through stretches of farmland at first, the fields empty except for the occasional group of crows picking through dry patches of soil. The houses were spread far apart, most of them just single-story homes with rusted mailboxes and driveways disappearing into overgrown grass. The air outside looked heavy, like the kind that turns into fog when night falls. My tires crunched over loose gravel as the paved road turned rougher, and soon I was surrounded by dense trees on both sides. It was the kind of road where if your car broke down, you'd have no choice but to start walking. The sun was almost gone now, just an orange strip between the tree line and the gray clouds above. I switched on my headlights, but they only seemed to cut a narrow path through the shadows ahead. I passed no other cars. Not one. The silence in the car felt louder because of it, every bump and rattle of the vehicle magnified. About 20 minutes in, I started noticing how the trees here seemed thicker, darker. The branches leaned over the road as if they were reaching for each other, forming a tunnel that my car was forced to push through. Fallen leaves scattered in every gust of wind, and every so often, I'd spot a flash of movement at the edge of the light. Probably just a rabbit or a raccoon, I told myself. But they never ran across the road. They just lingered there, at the limit of my vision, before disappearing again. The GPS still showed I had over an hour to go before I'd hit a larger road again. The battery on my phone had dropped to under 30%, which meant I had to keep it plugged into the car. I kept my eyes on the narrow path ahead, trying not to think too much about how isolated I was out here. Then it happened. It wasn't loud, not at first, just a small, sharp pop from somewhere under my car, followed by a grinding noise that made my stomach sink. I eased onto the shoulder, if you could even call it that. The road had no real shoulder, just a strip of dirt before it dropped into weeds and roots. I stepped out into the heavy, damp air and crouched near the front tire. A flat, completely ruined. I opened the trunk, pulled out the spare, and got to work. The air was colder than I expected, and there was a faint smell of wet earth, like the ground had soaked up rain a few hours ago. My flashlight beam shook as I worked. It wasn't fear yet, just the effort of trying to get it done quickly. Every small sound in the woods around me caught my attention. A twig snapping, leaves crunching, the occasional drip of water hitting the ground. I was almost done when I heard something heavier than an animal. A slow, deliberate step. Then another. It wasn't close, maybe 20 or 30 feet into the trees, but it was too heavy for a raccoon or fox. I froze, holding the tire iron halfway between the ground and the wheel. The steps stopped when I stopped. I scanned the tree line with the flashlight, but the beam hit only dark trunks and low branches. I told myself to keep going, and I did, but my pace quickened. I shoved the flat into the trunk, slammed it shut, and got back in the driver's seat. My breathing was uneven now, though I tried to keep it steady. The car started fine, and I pulled back onto the road without looking back. For a few minutes, nothing happened. Just the sound of my tires on the gravel and the glare of the headlights ahead. Then, in the corner of my eye, I saw it, movement along the tree line, pacing my car. I turned my head, and for the briefest moment, I caught the shape of a figure between the trees. It was too tall and thin to be an animal, and the way it moved, it wasn't running, but it was keeping pace with me. I pressed the gas harder, feeling the car bump and jolt over the uneven surface. The figure disappeared into the dark, but my grip on the wheels stayed tight. I kept glancing at my mirrors, half expecting to see headlights behind me, but there was nothing, only the black ribbon of road stretching into more woods. I told myself I was imagining it, that maybe I'd seen the shadow of a tree swaying in the wind, but the road was dead still. Not a branch moved. I passed an old wooden fence, its posts leaning with age, and spotted what looked like an old driveway disappearing into the forest. It had no gate, no mailbox, just a gap between the trees. As I passed it, my headlights caught something, two faint reflections like eyes catching the light. They were low to the ground, but they didn't blink or move as I drove past. My stomach was in knots now. Every instinct told me to get out of there, but the road kept stretching on with no sign of change. My GPS was glitching, the map freezing before jumping ahead again. The battery was down to 15%. After what felt like half an hour, I saw another break in the trees, this one wider, with a small clearing. In the middle of it was an abandoned pickup truck, rusted and covered in moss. Its windows were gone, and the tires were flat, half sunk into the dirt. Something about it felt wrong. The way it sat there, facing the road, as if it had been waiting for something for years. I didn't slow down. The next time I heard the footsteps, they were closer. But this time, they weren't coming from the woods. They were behind me. I checked the mirror, and my blood went cold. Far down the road, in the faint red glow of my taillights, was a figure standing in the center of the path. Not moving, just watching. I couldn't see a face, but I could tell it was tall. Too tall to be a teenager messing around out here. I pressed the gas harder, my heart pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. The road curved sharply, and when I came out of it, the figure was gone from the mirror. For a second, I thought maybe I'd finally lost it, until I saw the faint outline of something in my headlights, farther ahead now, on the right side of the road. It was as if it had cut through the woods and gotten ahead of me. I didn't slow down. I didn't even blink. I kept my hands locked on the wheel, eyes fixed on the road ahead. My phone battery dropped to 10%. I turned the GPS off completely to save power. Minutes dragged by. The figure didn't appear again. The trees began to thin, and I spotted the faint orange glow of streetlights far ahead. Relief flooded through me, but it was mixed with something else, a sick feeling that I was still being watched. When I finally hit the paved highway again, I didn't look back. I drove until I was in a well-lit gas station, surrounded by people and noise. My hands were still shaking as I filled the tank. Even now, I can't explain what I saw. I just know that something was out there on that road, and it wanted me to know I wasn't alone, and I will never take that route again. It started with the kind of day that felt heavy even before it truly began. The sky was dull and gray, with that flat, colorless light that makes it hard to tell the time without looking at a watch. I had been planning to go hiking for a while, and even though the weather looked uninviting, I decided I'd do it anyway. It was one of those plans I'd been putting off for weeks, and I knew that if I didn't go now, I probably wouldn't go for months. I packed my small backpack with a bottle of water, a few snacks, a flashlight, and my phone. The air was cool, maybe in the mid-50s, and I could feel that kind of dampness that clings to your skin even if it isn't raining. The trail I chose wasn't a tourist one. It wasn't some well-maintained path with wooden signs or neat little benches along the way. It was the kind of trail that locals used if they knew about it, a narrow dirt path that cut into the side of a hill and disappeared into the trees. I parked my car at a small pull-off on the side of the road, barely big enough for one vehicle, and locked it behind me. I stood there for a moment, listening to the sounds around me. The road was quiet. No cars, no distant hum of traffic, just a faint rustle of leaves and the occasional creak of branches swaying in the wind. It felt isolated in a way that was both peaceful and a little unnerving. The trail began with a gradual incline, leading me deeper into the woods. The trees here were tall and thin, with dark trunks that seemed to crowd closer together the further I went. The dirt beneath my boots was soft from the moisture in the air, and every step made a muted thud. As I moved forward, the sound of the road faded until there was nothing but the wind through the branches and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. My breath came in slow, steady pulls, and I could feel the tension in my shoulders easing. For the first half hour, it felt like a normal hike, just me, the trees, and the cool air. About 40 minutes in, the trail began to narrow. It curved along the edge of a slope, with a steep drop on one side covered in underbrush. The ground here was uneven, with small rocks jutting out that made me watch my footing. It was then that I noticed something odd, a set of deep footprints in the dirt, going in the same direction as me. They weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. The edges were still crisp, not yet softened by wind or rain. They were large, maybe belonging to a man, and spaced far apart as if the person was moving quickly. I followed them for a while without thinking much about it, but something about their length made me uneasy. Whoever made them had a long stride. I kept walking, trying to shake the thought. It wasn't uncommon to run into other hikers, even on these less-known trails. But the more I went, the more I realized I hadn't seen or heard anyone else all morning. The silence was heavy now, so complete that even the wind seemed to have died. I started to hear my own footsteps louder than before, and beneath them, the soft thump of my heart in my chest. I glanced back once, just to make sure no one was behind me. The trail behind was empty, fading into the trees. As the trail climbed higher, the forest began to change. The trees grew denser, blocking out more of the dim light from the sky. The air felt cooler, almost cold, and I could see my breath faintly. I noticed a faint smell in the air, earthy, but with something else, something faintly sour. It wasn't strong enough to place, but it clung to the air like a faint warning. I slowed down without realizing it, scanning the sides of the path for any sign of what it might be. The underbrush was thick, tangled with thorny vines and fallen branches, and I could barely see more than a few feet into it. Then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic crunching of leaves from somewhere behind me. It was soft, almost too soft to notice, but it was there, just out of sync with my own steps. I froze mid-stride, and the sound stopped too. I stood perfectly still, straining to hear past the blood pounding in my ears. The silence stretched out long enough that I started to think I imagined it. Slowly, I took another step forward. Almost immediately, the sound returned. A soft crunch. Another. Closer this time. The realization crawled into my mind and stayed there. Someone was walking behind me, matching my steps. I didn't turn around. I didn't want to. My pace quickened, and so did the sound behind me. The prints I had seen earlier flashed in my mind, and now they felt like a warning I had ignored. My throat felt tight, my mouth dry. I didn't want to run, not yet. Running would mean I knew they were there, and I didn't want to show that. The trail ahead curved sharply to the left, and just before the bend, I stepped off into the underbrush, moving as quietly as I could. I crouched low, heart hammering in my chest, and peered back down the trail. For a moment, there was nothing, just the empty path, stretching into the trees. Then I saw movement, a figure stepping into view, walking slowly, scanning the trail ahead. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket with the hood up, hands in his pockets. His head turned slightly, and even from a distance, I could see that he was looking for something, or someone. He stopped not far from where I had left the trail. I held my breath so tightly my lungs ached. He stood there for what felt like a full minute, glancing around, then slowly kept moving forward, his steps deliberate and steady. I waited until he was out of sight before I moved again. I didn't go back to the trail. Instead, I cut through the underbrush in the opposite direction, moving as quickly and quietly as I could manage. Branches scraped at my jacket, and the ground was uneven, but I didn't care. I just needed to put as much distance as I could between me and that man. It was harder to navigate without the trail. The forest seemed to press in from all sides, and every direction looked the same. I stopped once to listen, and for a moment, I thought I heard faint movement again, off to my right. I started moving faster, nearly tripping over a fallen log. My legs burned, my breath came in sharp bursts, and my hands were scratched from pushing branches out of the way. Eventually, I spotted what looked like a faint path ahead, maybe an animal trail, and I followed it downhill. The slope grew steeper, and I slid on the damp leaves more than once, catching myself on nearby trees. My chest ached from the effort, but I didn't stop until I reached a small, shallow stream at the bottom. I crouched beside it, trying to catch my breath, listening for any sign that I was still being followed. The forest was still again, but I didn't trust it. I decided to follow the stream. It would lead somewhere, maybe back to the road, maybe to another trail. At least it gave me a direction. The water was icy against my boots, but I stayed in the stream bed as much as I could, knowing it would make my trail harder to follow. My legs were starting to shake from the cold and the adrenaline, but I kept going, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. After what felt like hours, the stream curved sharply, and I saw a break in the trees ahead. The ground rose slightly, and beyond it, I caught sight of the road. Relief hit me like a wave, but it was quickly followed by a sharp edge of fear. If that man had guessed where I was heading, he could already be there. I slowed down, crouching low, and scanned the road before stepping out. It looked empty, just a strip of wet asphalt winding through the forest. My car was about 50 yards away. I moved quickly, keeping close to the trees until I was right beside it. My hands fumbled with the keys, and I kept glancing around, my pulse loud in my ears. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. The sound was loud in the stillness. As I pulled out onto the road, I looked into the mirror and saw nothing but empty asphalt stretching behind me. No figure, no movement. But the unease didn't fade. Even as the trees thinned and I left the forest behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been followed the whole way. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station miles away. I sat there in the driver's seat for a long time, my hands gripping the wheel, replaying everything in my head. I knew I had been followed. I knew I had been watched. And the worst part was knowing that if I hadn't stepped off that trail when I did, I might not have been sitting there at all. It was late afternoon when I decided to take a drive out to the countryside. I had been feeling restless all week, my head cluttered with work and noise, and I needed to get away from the city. I picked a route I didn't normally take, one that wound through old farmland and long stretches of empty fields. I didn't plan to go anywhere in particular, just drive until I felt like turning around. The air was warm but not heavy, the kind of weather that makes you want to roll the windows down and let the wind fill the car. I had a thermos of coffee in the cup holder, music playing softly, and nothing but open road ahead of me. As the sun dropped lower, the sky turned a pale orange. The fields seemed endless, with patches of woods scattered far off in the distance. Occasionally, I'd pass an abandoned barn or a leaning fence, but I hardly saw any houses. I noticed that the road itself grew narrower the farther I went, the asphalt cracking in places, weeds pushing up through the seams. The kind of road you know doesn't get much use anymore. I thought about turning around before it got too dark, but the quiet was strangely comforting, so I kept going. After about an hour, I came to a stretch where the road dipped slightly between two hills. There was a line of trees on one side, tall and dense, their branches reaching far over the ditch. On the other side was a barbed wire fence, and beyond it a huge empty pasture. Something about that spot made me slow down. Maybe it was the shadows gathering under the trees, or the way the wind seemed to stop there. My headlights weren't on yet, but the sun was low enough that the colors around me had lost their brightness. I noticed a narrow dirt track branching off from the road and vanishing into the trees. It didn't look like a driveway. It was too overgrown and uneven, but it had tire ruts, like it had been used recently. I should have kept going, but I stopped the car, sat there for a moment, and looked down that dirt track. There was no sign, no mailbox, nothing to say what it led to. I don't even know what I was thinking, maybe just curiosity, or maybe the strange stillness there made me feel like I had to see where it went. I turned the wheel, eased the car onto the dirt, and started down the track. The trees closed in almost immediately, blocking most of the light. The air inside that stretch was cooler, the ground damp. The ruts were deep, and I had to drive slowly to keep from bottoming out. The further I went, the rougher it got. My tires crunched over fallen branches, and the sides of my car brushed against bushes and low limbs. There was no place wide enough to turn around, and after a few minutes, I started wondering if I had made a mistake. Then I saw it, an old trailer sitting in a small clearing. It looked like it had been there for years. The metal siding was streaked with rust, and some of the windows were covered with cardboard instead of glass. A couple of plastic chairs sat tipped over in the dirt, and a pile of junk, scrap wood, a broken fridge door, torn tarps, was stacked off to one side. There were no vehicles, no lights, no movement. Just the trailer and the quiet. I stopped the car a little way back, engine idling. My first thought was that maybe it was abandoned. But there was something about the scene that didn't feel entirely dead. A black trash bag sat near the steps, tied up but not bloated from sitting in the sun too long. A length of rope hung from a branch nearby, swinging slightly, though there was no wind. The dirt around the trailer looked disturbed in places, like someone had been walking back and forth. I felt my skin prickle. I don't know why, but I cut the engine. The silence that followed felt heavier than before, like the trees around the clearing had closed in even tighter. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But then I noticed something else. Farther back in the clearing, near the tree line, there was a shape. At first I thought it was just a stump or a pile of brush, but as I stared, I realized it wasn't. It was a tarp, stretched loosely over something. The edges fluttered slightly, but I couldn't see what was underneath. I don't know how long I sat there staring at that tarp. Every part of me said to just back out, turn around, and leave. But reversing down that narrow track without hitting anything would have been tricky. I'd have to get out, at least for a moment, to check where my tires were. I cracked the door open, and the smell hit me. Not strong, but faint, like something damp and rotting. I stepped out, the dirt soft under my shoes. My car door creaked, too loud in the stillness. I walked to the back of the car, glancing around constantly. Every sound felt sharp, the crunch of my shoes, the faint tick of cooling metal from my engine. The tarp caught my eye again. I couldn't tell if it was covering something large or if the ground beneath it was uneven. My stomach felt tight. I decided I didn't need to know. I was just going to get in, back out slowly, and be gone. I slid back into the driver's seat, started the engine, and began reversing. The track behind me seemed darker now. I kept glancing into the mirrors, trying not to hit the trees. I was halfway back when I saw movement in my side mirror. Just a flicker, something stepping from behind the trailer into the open. My hands locked on the wheel. I didn't stop, just kept rolling back, eyes darting between mirrors. Then I saw it again, clearer this time. A man tall, wearing dark clothes. His face was partly hidden by the shadow of the trees, but his head was tilted slightly, like he was watching me. He didn't move toward the car, just stood there, still as the trees around him. My pulse hammered so hard I could hear it. I kept backing out, my tires slipping in the ruts. I didn't take my eyes off him until the trees finally hid him from view. When I reached the road, I didn't stop. I turned sharply, gravel spraying, and drove fast, my hands tight on the wheel. The sky was almost dark now, and every shadow along the roadside felt like it could be hiding someone. I drove until I hit a main road, then kept going until I saw the lights of a gas station. I pulled in, parked under the bright canopy, and sat there trying to steady my breathing. I didn't call anyone. I didn't tell anyone. I just sat until I felt sure my hands wouldn't shake on the wheel. Then I drove home. That night, I couldn't stop replaying it in my head. The trailer, the tarp, the man standing perfectly still. I kept thinking about how quiet it had been, how there hadn't been a single bird sound in that clearing. I wondered if he had been watching me from the moment I pulled in, standing just out of sight. I thought about the narrowness of that track, how there was no way out except the way I came in. I haven't driven that route again. I've looked for it on maps, tried to find where that dirt track might be, but nothing matches. Sometimes I think about what might have been under that tarp, or why that man didn't move toward me. Maybe he didn't need to. Maybe just letting me see him was enough to make sure I never came back. But the worst thought, the one I can't shake, is that if my car had stalled, or if I'd gotten out again for any reason, I might never have made it back to the road. The man didn't need to chase me. He already had me cornered, and I can still picture him in the mirror, tall, still, watching, waiting for something I didn't want to find out. It was already late in the afternoon when I decided to take the long way home. I had been walking for most of the day, wandering through back roads and narrow dirt trails just to get some time alone. The air was still, heavy with the kind of warmth that makes your clothes stick to your skin, but I didn't mind it. I just wanted the quiet. The road I chose cut between open farmland and a stretch of woods that I had never been through before. The fields were empty this time of year, just low stubble from a recent harvest, and the treeline to my right was so thick it looked like a solid wall of dark green. The path itself was little more than packed earth, just wide enough for one small vehicle. There were faint tire ruts in it, but from the way grass grew in between them, it seemed no one used it much. I had my backpack slung over one shoulder, a bottle of water in my hand. Every few minutes I took a sip, letting the lukewarm taste sit in my mouth before swallowing. The heat made the air smell of dust and sun-baked grass. Somewhere deep in the woods, I could hear a steady hum of insects, almost like a constant buzzing that blended into the background. The trail wound deeper between the fields and the trees, and before long, the farmland ended on the left side as well, replaced by more forest. Now I was surrounded on both sides by tall trees that seemed to lean inward, letting only narrow strips of light through the canopy. The shade was welcome, but it felt different here. The air was cooler, heavier. Every footstep crunched on layers of dry leaves, and occasionally a twig snapped beneath my shoes. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. Even the insects seemed far away now. The only sound I could hear was the scuff of my shoes and my own breathing. The trees were close enough that their branches overlapped above me, blocking out most of the sky. I checked my phone for the time, but the screen was dim from the glare and the signal bar was empty. No service. That didn't surprise me. Most rural areas were like that, but it did remind me that I was far from anyone else. After about another 20 minutes of walking, I noticed the ground ahead dipped slightly, and the path began to curve. As I followed it, I saw something up ahead that didn't look natural. It was a shape, tall and thin, maybe 100 feet ahead, standing just off to the side of the path. At first, I thought it might be a dead tree or a post, but the more I walked, the more I realized it was neither. It was a person. They were standing perfectly still, facing the trees instead of the path. Their clothes were dark, blending into the shadows, and from where I was, I couldn't make out much detail. They didn't move at all, not even a twitch of the head when I got closer. I slowed my pace without thinking, instinct telling me something was off. The silence around me suddenly felt heavier, like the air had thickened. I kept walking, my eyes locked on the figure. As I drew closer, I could see they were tall, maybe 6 feet, wearing a long-sleeved shirt despite the heat. Their hands hung at their sides, and their head was slightly tilted down, as if staring at something on the ground. I couldn't see their face from where I was. I walked past them, keeping to the far side of the trail. My steps felt too loud, each one crunching on leaves like a warning. They didn't turn or acknowledge me in any way. I didn't say anything. I didn't want to break the silence. I just wanted to be past them. When I was about 15 feet beyond, I let out a slow breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. I kept walking, resisting the urge to look back. My shoulders felt tense, and my heartbeat was faster than it should have been for a simple walk. Then, behind me, I heard it. Footsteps. They were faint at first, matching my pace, but there was no mistaking them. The soft, deliberate crunch of someone walking on dry leaves. My stomach tightened, and without thinking, I quickened my pace. The footsteps quickened too. I didn't want to run. Running would make noise, and noise would tell whoever it was that I knew they were following me. I tried to stay calm, moving steadily forward, scanning the sides of the trail for any sign of an exit or a landmark. The trees here were too thick to slip between quickly, and the undergrowth looked dense enough to trip me if I wasn't careful. After maybe a minute of this, the footsteps got closer. I could hear the faint swish of clothing now. I glanced over my shoulder, just a quick movement, and caught a glimpse of them. The same person, walking in the center of the path, head still tilted slightly, closing the gap between us. I faced forward again and kept moving, my grip tightening on the water bottle until my knuckles ached. I didn't know how much farther this path went before it hit a road or a clearing. My mind ran through possibilities. Maybe they lived nearby, maybe they were just walking the same way, but none of those thoughts felt right. The trail dipped again, and I realized I was heading downhill into a darker stretch of forest. The trees here were even taller, their trunks wide and gnarled. The light was dim enough that it felt like early evening, even though it wasn't. I could smell damp earth now, the scent of leaves that had been rotting for months. I decided I couldn't just keep walking in front of them. If they meant to do something, I was giving them every advantage. My eyes scanned the trees until I spotted one with a thick trunk just off the trail, big enough to hide behind. As I reached it, I stepped quickly off the path, pressing myself flat against the bark. I held my breath. The footsteps kept coming, slow and steady. Then they stopped. Silence. I stayed still, straining to hear anything, breathing, movement, but there was nothing. I waited, my chest tight, every muscle in my body tense. The quiet dragged on until my ears began to ring from it. Then, from somewhere deeper in the forest, I heard movement slow, deliberate, moving parallel to the trail. Whoever it was had stepped off the path too. I stayed where I was, hoping they would pass by, but the sound grew closer again, circling. I knew then that they weren't just heading the same way. They were tracking me. My heart was pounding now, and I forced myself to move. I stepped quietly around the opposite side of the tree and began moving away from the path entirely, pushing through the undergrowth. Branches snagged at my clothes and scratched my arms. I tried to move quickly but silently, heading uphill where the ground was firmer. The sound of their movement followed, always keeping pace, never rushing but never falling behind. I couldn't see them through the trees, but I could feel their presence, close enough that the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I don't know how long I kept going, maybe 10 minutes, maybe 20, before I spotted a break in the trees ahead. I pushed toward it, stumbling over roots, until I burst out into a clearing. It was an old logging site, the ground uneven and littered with stumps. Across it, I could see a gravel road. Relief surged through me, and I ran for it, no longer caring about the noise. My shoes slipped on loose stones as I reached the road and turned, looking back into the trees. There was nothing there. The forest edge was still and dark, no movement, no sound. I stood there, breathing hard, scanning the shadows for any sign of them. After a long moment, I started walking down the gravel road, putting as much distance as I could between myself and those woods. I didn't see anyone else until nearly an hour later, when the road met the highway. By then, the sun was starting to sink, and the woods behind me looked even darker. I never found out who that person was, or why they followed me, but I know they were there. And I know they meant to keep me from leaving that trail the easy way. Even now, when I think back to that silence in the trees, I can still hear the faint crunch of leaves behind me, steady and patient, like they had all the time in the world. It started as just another ordinary evening, nothing strange about it at first. The air was cool, the kind of calm temperature that made you feel comfortable without a jacket, but you could tell it would get colder later. The sun was already gone, the last of the daylight fading behind a low line of trees in the distance. I was driving back from town, taking the same back road I always did. The road wasn't well lit. Most of it had no streetlights at all, just the glow of my headlights cutting through the darkness ahead. There weren't many houses out here. The land was mostly open fields, scattered with patches of woods here and there. On one side, old barbed wire fences lined the edge of the road, behind which cows sometimes grazed during the day. On the other side, there was a stretch of dense woods that ran for a good mile before the next clearing. I'd driven this way hundreds of times, and I knew every curve, every dip, every place where the road narrowed so much that you'd have to slow down if another car came from the opposite direction. The first part of the drive was uneventful. I remember passing the Miller farm and noticing how dark their house was. They usually kept their porch light on, but it was completely black that night. Maybe they'd gone to bed early. I didn't think much of it at the time. I kept going, watching the familiar landmarks slide past in the yellow wash of my headlights. Then, as I rounded one of the bends near the woods, I caught sight of something in the distance, just barely lit up by the edge of my lights. It was on the left side of the road, maybe 30 or 40 yards ahead. At first, I thought it might have been a deer, but it wasn't moving like one. It was standing upright, completely still, like it was waiting. The shape was dark against the slightly lighter road behind it. I slowed down a little, not sure what I was looking at. As I got closer, the figure started to move, not toward me, but across the road. It didn't rush or seem startled. It walked in a slow, steady pace, crossing from the wood's side over to the open fields. I couldn't make out its face or much detail, but I could see that it was tall, with broad shoulders, and it didn't seem to be carrying anything. There was something strange about how deliberate the movement was. No hesitation, no glance toward my car, no sign that it even cared I was coming. I eased my foot off the gas and kept my eyes on it. My headlights caught more of it as I approached, and I could tell it was wearing dark clothes, something like a jacket or hoodie. The strange part was how smooth its movement was. It never looked at me, never turned its head. It just kept walking, making its way across the road, and then vanishing into the tall grass on the other side. I drove past the spot and glanced in my side mirror. The tall grass swayed slightly in the wind, but I didn't see any more movement. I felt an odd weight in my stomach, like something about it wasn't right. I'd seen plenty of people walking along the roads around here, farmhands, hikers, even hunters heading to their trucks, but this felt different. Most people would at least look at a car passing by, if only for safety. This person didn't. I kept driving, telling myself it was just someone out for a late walk. Maybe they lived nearby, though there weren't any houses for a good half-mile in that direction. My hands were tighter on the steering wheel than usual, and I realized I kept checking my rearview mirror every few seconds. Nothing but darkness followed me. By the time I got home, I'd almost convinced myself it didn't matter. I parked the car, grabbed my bag from the passenger seat, and went inside. My place was quiet, the faint hum of the fridge the only sound. I locked the door behind me out of habit and went to the kitchen to pour a glass of water. But then I noticed something odd. My driveway has a small gravel patch that crunches loudly when anyone walks on it. I was sure I heard a faint crunch outside, just for a moment. I froze, glass in hand, listening. It stopped after that single sound, so faint I wasn't even sure it was real. It could have been an animal. There are plenty of raccoons and stray cats that wander through here at night. I set the glass down and went to the window that faced the driveway. The outside light was on, but it only lit the area near the front steps. Beyond that, it was all shadow. The gravel driveway looked empty. I stayed there for a while, just staring out, waiting to see if something moved. Nothing did. Eventually, I went back to the kitchen, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just seen the start of something I didn't fully understand. That night, I kept thinking about the person I saw on the road. I kept replaying the way they crossed without any sign of caution, the way they disappeared into the grass without even glancing toward the woods or the open field. Every detail felt off, but there wasn't anything I could point to and call wrong. It was just the way the whole thing felt, too deliberate, too calm. The next morning, I woke up early and looked outside again. The driveway was empty, and the gravel looked untouched. I thought about walking down the road toward where I saw them the night before, but something about that idea didn't sit right with me. I didn't want to be anywhere near that stretch of road on foot. Over the next few days, I kept my normal routine, but I was more aware of my surroundings. I drove with my high beams on longer than I usually would. I checked behind me more often. And then, 2 nights later, it happened again. Same road, same time of night. I was coming back from town, headlights cutting through the dark, and just before the curve near the woods, I saw movement. It was them. Same height, same slow walk, same deliberate crossing from one side of the road to the other. This time, I slowed down more, almost to a crawl, watching them as closely as I could. My lights caught them for a moment, and I saw the edge of their face, pale, expressionless, eyes looking straight ahead instead of at me. They vanished into the grass on the opposite side again. I kept going, heart beating faster, but when I checked my rearview mirror, I thought I saw something. Not the figure crossing again, but movement along the side of the road, almost as if they had turned and were now walking in the same direction I was driving, just off the pavement. I couldn't see them clearly enough to be sure, but the thought of it was enough to make my skin prickle. That night, I double-checked all my locks before going to bed. I kept the outside light on until morning. I slept lightly, waking up at the smallest sound, certain I'd hear footsteps on the gravel again. It's been weeks now. I still take that road because there's no better way home, but every time I reach that stretch near the woods, I slow down, my eyes scanning both sides of the road. Most nights, there's nothing there. But every so often, I catch a glimpse, just enough to know they're still around. Always crossing slowly. Always disappearing into the grass. Always without looking at me. And I've started to notice something new. When I pass that spot now, even on nights when I don't see anyone, I sometimes get the feeling that someone is already standing in the shadows, just outside my headlights, watching me go by. I don't know who they are or why they're there. But I do know that whatever they're doing, it's not just aimless wandering. It's too precise, too consistent. And the worst part is, I've started to think they know exactly who I am. I'm certain now, one night soon, I'm not just going to see them on the road. I'm going to see them somewhere much closer. It started as a quiet evening. I had driven out to the old gravel road that ran past the edge of town, the one hardly anyone used anymore, unless they had a reason to go that far. My plan was simple: park near the clearing by the river, get some fresh air, and maybe take a short walk before heading home. I had packed a flashlight, a bottle of water, and a folding knife in my pocket, more out of habit than necessity. The sun had been sinking when I got there, the last streaks of orange fading behind the tree line. By the time I stepped out of the car, the air already felt cooler, the shadows longer, the sky turning into that deep blue that means night is coming fast. The gravel under my boots crunched as I crossed the clearing. The grass was overgrown in places, waist-high in patches where no one had driven through in a long time. On the far side of the clearing, the trees stood close together, their trunks black against the dim light, their tops swaying slightly in the breeze. Beyond them, I knew, the river ran in a slow curve. I could hear the faint, steady hiss of the water if I stopped moving. The smell was sharp, damp earth, fallen leaves, and that faint metallic scent rivers sometimes carry. I walked toward the tree line, keeping the flashlight off for now. My eyes adjusted to the dim light, and the shapes of the forest grew clearer. The ground was uneven here, with roots poking up and loose stones hidden in the leaves. Somewhere off to my left, I heard the sudden rush of something small moving, probably a rabbit or squirrel startled by my steps. The sound faded quickly, but it made me more aware of just how far from anyone else I was. After a few minutes, I reached the edge where the trees gave way to the slope leading down to the riverbank. The ground dropped steeply, the dirt loose and damp in spots, and I had to place each step carefully. The air here felt cooler, heavier, as if the river was drawing in the warmth from everything around it. When I reached the bottom, the water was only a few feet away, sliding past in the low light, smooth and almost black. The far bank was just a dark wall of trees. I stood there for a while listening. The water, the soft rustle of leaves overhead, the occasional snap of a twig somewhere deep in the woods. It was all normal. But it was also the kind of quiet that made every sound stand out. I felt it creeping into me, making me hyper-aware of every shift in the air, every faint noise that didn't quite fit. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just the isolation. Still, I found my hand drifting to the flashlight in my pocket. I decided to walk upriver for a bit. The bank narrowed in places, forcing me closer to the trees. My boots sank into soft patches of mud, leaving deep prints that quickly filled with water. A few times I caught the smell of something stronger than the river. Wet moss, maybe, or the beginnings of rot from fallen branches. The light was fading fast now, the river turning into a dark, moving strip, the opposite bank a solid black wall. I finally pulled out the flashlight and clicked it on, the beam cutting sharply through the gloom. The light made everything look smaller, flatter, but it also meant I couldn't see much beyond its reach. The darkness outside the beam seemed thicker. I had been walking maybe 10 minutes when I heard it. Not the quick, light sound of an animal, but something heavier, slower. It came from behind me, back toward the way I had come. I froze, listening. The sound stopped. I stood still for what felt like a full minute, but nothing moved. Finally, I told myself it could have been a branch falling, or maybe the ground shifting near the bank. I kept walking, a little faster now. A few minutes later, I heard it again. This time it was closer. 2 distinct steps, then silence. I swung the flashlight toward the trees, but the beam only showed rough bark, tangled undergrowth, and shadows. My chest felt tight. I turned back toward the direction of the clearing, deciding it was better to head out before it got fully dark. I tried to move quietly, but the leaves and twigs underfoot seemed to crack louder with every step. I kept glancing over my shoulder, the beam of my light swinging back and forth. Halfway back, the noise came again, but now it wasn't just behind me, it was to my right, deeper in the trees. It was the sound of someone, or something, moving with care but not enough to be completely silent. My stomach twisted. I stopped and crouched slightly, turning off the flashlight. The dark was almost complete now, just enough light from the sky to make out shapes. My ears strained for the next sound. At first there was nothing, then soft, deliberate steps, moving parallel to me. I stayed still until the sound faded, then slowly started moving again, this time keeping my light off and my footsteps as quiet as I could manage. I knew the clearing wasn't far now, maybe another 5 minutes if I kept a steady pace. The slope back up was steeper than I remembered, and my legs felt heavier with each step. When I finally reached the top, I could see the faint outline of the open space ahead, my car just beyond it. I clicked the flashlight on again, sweeping it across the clearing. That's when I saw movement on the far side, near the tree line opposite my car. It wasn't fast, just a slow, shifting shadow that was clearly upright. My throat went dry. I couldn't make out details, only that it was taller than me and standing still, facing in my direction. I kept the light on it for a moment longer, but it didn't move. I started walking toward my car, keeping the beam steady, my other hand in my pocket gripping the knife. The gravel crunched under my boots as I crossed the open space. I was almost to the driver's side when I heard footsteps again, this time on the gravel behind me. I didn't turn around. I yanked the door open, slid in, and slammed it shut. My hands shook as I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I threw the car into reverse, the headlights flooding the clearing. In that brief wash of light, I saw the figure clearly for the first time. A man tall, wearing dark clothes, standing just at the edge where the clearing met the trees. His face was turned slightly away, but I could see the pale shape of it. He didn't move as I backed up, just stood there watching. I spun the wheel and drove forward, gravel spraying out behind the tires. My eyes kept flicking to the rearview mirror, but after a few seconds the clearing was gone, replaced by the dark ribbon of the road. I drove faster than I should have on that uneven gravel, the steering wheel trembling under my hands. Only when I reached the main road did I let myself slow down. My pulse was still hammering in my ears, and my mouth was dry. I kept looking at the mirrors all the way home. That night I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shape of him standing there, still as a post, watching. I kept thinking about the way he moved in the woods, keeping pace with me without getting too close, how he stayed just out of sight until the last moment. There was no reason for anyone to be out there. No reason except me. I didn't go back to that clearing again. Even now, I still think about what might have happened if I had stayed down by the river just a little longer, or if I had turned to look behind me when I heard those last footsteps. Some things, I've decided, are better left unknown. It was supposed to be a simple walk home. The sun had already dropped behind the horizon, and the air carried that heavy stillness that comes right after dusk, when everything feels like it's holding its breath. I had stayed later than I should have at a friend's place, and now the only way home was the path that cut through the wooded area behind the neighborhood. It wasn't deep forest, but it was thick enough that once you were in, the houses vanished from sight and the road was far away. I'd walked this way hundreds of times before in daylight, but at night it felt like an entirely different place, colder, darker, and much too quiet. The path started at a narrow break between two back fences. It was just dirt, worn smooth from years of kids riding bikes through it, and in the dark it looked like a tunnel into the trees. I stepped inside and almost immediately felt the air change. The warmth from the day was gone, replaced by a damp chill that clung to my skin. The smell of earth and rotting leaves hung in the air. My footsteps sounded louder than I expected, each one crunching on gravel and snapping twigs. I noticed how the sound didn't seem to carry far, just faded quickly into the dark around me, like the trees were swallowing it. The first stretch was about 50 yards straight in, and then it curved to the left where the trees grew thicker. I could still see the last bits of twilight through the branches overhead, but they were fading fast. The deeper I went, the more I felt the ground under me turn soft and uneven, roots jutting out and catching at my shoes. Somewhere ahead, I could hear a slow, rhythmic dripping, like water falling from a branch onto a pile of leaves. It was strangely loud, the kind of sound you wouldn't notice during the day, but that seemed amplified at night. As I walked, I became aware of something else. There was no wind at all. The branches weren't moving, and the leaves didn't rustle. Even the usual nighttime sounds, crickets and distant barking dogs, seemed absent. It was just the sound of my own footsteps, and that faint dripping ahead. I kept walking, telling myself not to overthink it, but I started glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. The darkness behind me looked thicker than the darkness ahead, as if it were closing in. I rounded the bend in the path, and realized that I could no longer see the faint glow from the streetlights behind me. Now, it was just blackness pressing in from all sides. I could barely make out the outline of the trail ahead, just enough to keep walking without stumbling too much. That's when I heard it, another set of footsteps. Light, deliberate, coming from somewhere behind me. They weren't in sync with mine, and every time I stopped to listen, they stopped too. My ears strained in the silence, trying to pick them out again, but there was nothing except my own breathing and the drip, drip, drip ahead. I told myself it was probably an animal. This area had stray cats, raccoons, even the occasional fox. But I couldn't shake the feeling that these steps sounded too human, too careful. I started walking again, a little faster now, trying to keep my pace steady so it wouldn't look like I was hurrying. My heart was beating harder than I wanted it to, and my mouth felt dry. I could feel a bead of sweat forming at my temple despite the cold air. The path widened slightly ahead, opening into a small clearing where a power line cut through the trees. The ground here was a mix of gravel and hard-packed dirt, easier to walk on, but the openness made me feel exposed. I stopped for a moment, looking down the power line's narrow cut. It stretched away in both directions, disappearing into darkness. For a second, I considered leaving the path and walking along it to the road, but it was overgrown with tall grass and brush. I stayed where I was, straining to hear anything behind me. That's when I caught it again, footsteps, this time quicker, like whoever it was had closed some of the distance. They stopped almost as soon as I noticed them. I turned, staring back into the black tunnel I had just walked through, but I couldn't see a thing. The shadows between the trees were too dense. My stomach felt tight, my body tense and ready to move. I didn't want to run yet. I was afraid that would turn whatever was following me into a chase. I forced myself forward, back into the trees. The path narrowed again, and the darkness felt heavier now, pressing down on my shoulders. My ears kept picking up tiny sounds, a twig snapping, leaves shifting, but they came from different spots each time, like whoever was out there was moving in a wide arc around me. I tried to tell myself it was still just animals, maybe more than one, but deep down I knew it wasn't. There was a rhythm to the movements, a patience that felt intentional. Up ahead, I knew the path would cross a shallow creek. It wasn't wide, maybe 3 feet across, with flat stones you could step on to get over. I focused on that spot, telling myself that once I crossed it, I'd be close to the neighborhood again. The sound of the water reached me before I saw it, a quiet trickle that should have been comforting, but somehow wasn't. As I stepped closer, I noticed the smell of wet mud and something else, something faint but sharp, like rust or old blood. I bent down, using my hand to steady myself as I stepped onto the first stone. The creek was barely moving, just enough to reflect a dull shimmer of moonlight through the trees. I crossed quickly, my shoes slipping slightly on the damp rock, and stepped back onto the dirt path. The moment I did, I heard a splash behind me. Not a rock slipping into the water, but something heavy stepping directly into the creek. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up. Slowly, I turned my head just enough to look over my shoulder. I couldn't see much, just the faint outline of the creek and the shadows crowding around it. But I knew something was there. I couldn't explain how I knew, but I felt it, someone standing just far enough back to be hidden, watching me. My skin prickled, and I realized my breathing had gone shallow and quick. Without thinking, I started walking again, faster this time, my feet crunching through the gravel and dirt. My arms felt tense and awkward at my sides, like I didn't know what to do with them. The path began to slope upward, and I could feel my legs burning as I pushed myself to move faster. The trees here were closer together, their branches arching overhead so tightly that I could barely see the sky. I risked one glance back and instantly regretted it. For a split second, I saw a darker shape against the darkness, tall and still, standing where I had just been. It didn't move, but I could feel its attention on me like a weight pressing between my shoulder blades. I kept going, nearly jogging now, my shoes catching on roots and rocks. My lungs burned, and I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. I knew the end of the path was close, maybe 200 feet away, where it would open up to the street behind my neighborhood. I thought about sprinting, but I was afraid that if I tripped, I wouldn't have time to get up before whoever, or whatever, it was reached me. The path curved one last time, and I saw the faint orange glow of a streetlight ahead. Relief surged through me, but I didn't slow down. I kept my eyes locked on that light, moving as fast as I could without breaking into a full run. Behind me, I thought I heard another quick set of steps, but I didn't turn around. I reached the end of the path and stepped out into the open, the sudden brightness of the streetlight almost blinding me. I stood there for a moment, trying to catch my breath, my chest heaving. When I finally turned back toward the path, it was empty. Just a dark tunnel of trees leading back into the woods. I stood there for another minute, my ears straining, but there was nothing. No movement, no sound. Still, I knew I hadn't imagined it. Something had been in there with me, keeping pace, staying just out of sight. I walked the rest of the way home without looking back again. That night, I locked every door and window in the house before going to bed. Even though I was inside, the feeling stayed with me, the sense of being watched, of someone waiting just beyond the edge of the light. I didn't take that path again after dark. And every time I pass the entrance now, I can't help but think about the shape I saw standing in the shadows, completely still, as if it knew I'd be back one day. But I won't. I had been driving for hours, the kind of long stretch where the road feels endless, and the world outside the windshield is nothing but darkness, broken only by the faint white lines sliding past under the headlights. The weather had been getting worse as I moved deeper into the countryside. The drizzle that started in the afternoon had turned into steady rain, and now the wipers scraped rhythmically across the glass, smearing water in a constant back-and-forth motion. I could feel the damp air seeping into the car through the vents, carrying the smell of wet asphalt and mud. It was late, well past midnight, and I had not seen another vehicle in at least an hour. I had planned to make it to the next town before stopping for the night, but according to the last road sign I'd passed, it was still another 28 miles away. That wouldn't be a problem under normal circumstances, but the fuel gauge had been inching toward empty for the last 30 miles, and I was starting to feel that familiar, uneasy tightness in my chest. Out here, there were no streetlights, no open gas stations, no buildings, just narrow blacktop cutting through thick, wooded hills. The road had a way of making me feel smaller than I already was. It twisted and dipped through patches of dense forest that looked like black walls on either side of me. When the headlights caught the tree trunks, they appeared slick and wet, their bark glistening like they were made of metal. Every so often, the beams would catch a glint of water from a puddle or a flash of an animal's eyes reflecting back at me from the underbrush. The rest was just shadows and the soft roar of rain hitting the roof. I kept checking the fuel gauge like it would change if I stared at it long enough. The needle was now just above the red, hovering in that zone where you're never sure how much farther you can go. I eased off the gas a little, thinking maybe I could stretch it. My phone had no signal. It had been dead to the outside world for the last 40 minutes. I tried not to think about the fact that if I ran out of gas here, I would have to walk in the rain, along this road, with nothing around for miles. Around another bend, the road narrowed slightly, and the tree cover thickened. The darkness seemed heavier here. I noticed something strange on the shoulder up ahead, a faint, pale shape just barely visible against the black backdrop of wet trees. At first, I thought it was a road marker or a fallen branch catching the light in a strange way. As I got closer, the shape became clearer. It was a car. It was pulled awkwardly onto the side of the road, almost in the ditch, its nose angled downward as if it had slid there. The rear lights were off, but the hazard lights blinked faintly, each flash distorted through the curtain of rain. They were weak, irregular, as though the battery was almost dead. The car itself was dark-colored, the kind of shade that disappears against a wet night, making it nearly invisible unless you were right on top of it. My first thought was to slow down and see if someone needed help, but then another, sharper thought cut in. Why hadn't I seen anyone? No movement, no sign of a person outside. I passed the car slowly, scanning the interior through the side window. It was hard to see through the rain, but the driver's seat looked empty. The passenger seat, too. I felt that same uncomfortable tightness return, only now it was sharper. I eased back onto the gas, telling myself whoever had been in that car had probably already left to get help, maybe walked to the next town. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The rain hammered harder against the roof, drowning out the hum of the tires. A mile or two later, the forest opened up slightly on the right side, revealing a dirt pull-off area used for logging trucks. I pulled over there for a moment, partly to get my bearings, partly because I couldn't ignore the feeling that I needed to stop driving blind like this. I turned off the engine to save fuel, leaving only the dim glow of the dashboard lighting the interior. The rain seemed louder without the engine's noise. I sat there listening. There was nothing but the rain and the faint creak of cooling metal from the hood. The road behind me was empty, no headlights in sight. I tried to think about what I'd just seen. The car back there, it wasn't just pulled over. It looked abandoned in a hurry. The hazards were on but fading, which meant it had been sitting there a while. Then a sound. Not from the road, not from my car, but from somewhere out in the trees to the right. It was faint, but distinct, wet footsteps moving slowly through mud and leaves. I froze, every muscle in my body tensed. The sound stopped as quickly as it started. I told myself it could have been an animal, but the pace, the rhythm, it had been too deliberate. I started the car again, my hand tight around the gear shift. As I eased back onto the road, the headlights caught something at the far edge of the pull-off, a footprint in the mud. Human, barely visible, half filled with rainwater, but definitely a footprint. I kept driving. My hands were gripping the wheel so hard they hurt. The road curved sharply left, and as I came around it, the beams cut through another gap in the trees. My stomach tightened instantly. There was movement in the forest. At first, it was just a suggestion, something shifting between the trunks, too large to be a deer, too tall. The rain made it harder to see, but the shape was there, matching my pace for a few seconds before fading into the darkness again. I pushed the car faster despite the slick road, the fuel gauge dipping closer to empty. The next 15 minutes were nothing but rain, winding road, and the sound of my own breathing. Every patch of shadow felt alive. My eyes kept darting to the mirrors, half expecting to see headlights or something else. But the road stayed empty. When the first sign of the town appeared, a faint glow on the horizon, I felt a small rush of relief. I told myself I'd get fuel, find a place to stay, and forget about the abandoned car and the footprints in the mud. But as I reached the edge of the town, passing the first dim street lamp, I noticed the wet sheen of fresh footprints along the roadside. They weren't there from earlier. They were headed in the same direction I was going, and they hadn't been washed away by the rain. I kept driving straight through the town, past the closed gas stations, past the few darkened houses. I didn't stop until I hit the next town over, where there were lights, people, and the noise of normal life. Only then did I feel like I could breathe again, though I kept glancing in the mirror, half expecting to see something walking just at the edge of the headlights. Even now, I can still picture the shape in the trees, the way it moved without rushing, without stumbling, like it had all the time in the world to catch up to me if it wanted. And I don't know if it ever did. It started as a normal day, but it ended up being something I still think about all the time. I had gone out in the late afternoon to do some hiking. There was an old trail near the edge of town that I had always wanted to explore more deeply. Most people didn't use it anymore because the newer, cleaner hiking paths had opened closer to the main road, but something about the old one always drew me in. It was narrow, uneven, and surrounded by thick trees on both sides. The branches reached so far over the trail that in some areas it felt like a tunnel, blocking out the sky and making the light dim even when the sun was still up. By the time I parked my car near the trail entrance, it was about 4:30 in the afternoon. I figured I had enough daylight to go a few miles in and back before dark. The air was heavy with that smell of damp leaves and soil. The rain from the previous night had left the ground soft, and the leaves stuck to my shoes. I walked slowly at first, just taking in the sounds of the forest, birds calling in short bursts, the distant rush of water from a stream somewhere to my right, and the occasional creak of tree trunks moving in the breeze. The trail started out wide enough for two people to walk side by side, but within half a mile it narrowed to where I had to walk in a single line, brushing against wet ferns and bushes. The ground was uneven with rocks sticking out and tree roots curling over the dirt like thick ropes. I was focused on keeping my balance, watching my steps carefully. Every now and then, I looked up to see where the trail led, but the twists and turns kept me from seeing more than 100 feet ahead at any time. After about 40 minutes, I reached a fork I had never seen before. The main trail curved to the left, but there was a smaller, overgrown path heading right. It looked like it hadn't been walked in years. My curiosity pulled me toward it. The branches hung lower here, and I had to duck under some of them to get through. The smell of the forest grew stronger, almost earthy and stale, as if this part didn't get much fresh air. The further I went, the quieter it became. The bird sounds faded, and even the wind seemed to stop. The only noise I could hear was the soft crunch of my shoes on damp leaves and the faint drip of water falling from branches. It was strange how quickly the atmosphere shifted from peaceful to tense. My skin prickled slightly, the way it does when you feel like someone is watching you. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but there was nothing, just the same dark, tangled trees. I kept going, thinking maybe the path would lead to an old structure or viewpoint. Instead, it sloped downward into a small hollow where the light was dim, even though it was still daytime. The air felt cooler here. The ground was muddy, and my shoes sank slightly with each step. I noticed faint impressions in the mud, footprints. They were human, but not fresh. Some had edges softened by rain, but others looked sharper, maybe from earlier that morning. They led further down the path. I followed them for a while until they disappeared into a patch of darker mud that seemed more disturbed, as if someone had been standing there for a long time. The prints didn't go further, and I couldn't tell which direction the person had gone. I stood there for a moment, scanning the trees. That's when I noticed a faint sound ahead, something like a branch snapping. It was far enough away that it didn't startle me immediately, but it didn't fit with the stillness around me. I crouched slightly and listened. Another snap, then a faint rustling, as if something, or someone, was moving slowly through the undergrowth. I couldn't see anything through the thick trees, but the sound wasn't random. It came in short bursts, then stopped, then started again. I began to feel uneasy. The smart choice would have been to turn back, but part of me wanted to know what was there. I moved forward carefully, placing each step so it wouldn't make much noise. The mud made it hard, and once or twice I slipped slightly, catching myself on nearby branches. The sounds ahead grew clearer. It wasn't just rustling anymore, it was breathing. Slow, heavy breaths, the kind that sound almost deliberate. I froze in place, straining my ears. The breathing stopped. The silence was worse. I scanned the trees again, but but everything looked the same: dark trunks, tangled branches, wet leaves. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a shift in the shadows between two trees. It wasn't a clear shape, just movement, but it was enough to make my stomach tighten. I started to back away, slowly at first. My boots sank into the mud, making faint sucking sounds with each step. Then I heard it again, the breathing, this time closer. My heart started pounding hard enough that I could hear it in my ears. I turned fully and began walking faster, keeping my head straight, but scanning my peripheral vision for movement. The trail behind me seemed darker than before. I couldn't remember exactly how far I had gone down this overgrown path, but it suddenly felt like I had been walking much longer than I had. The trees were closing in, the space between them narrowing, forcing me to brush past wet branches. The air felt heavier, and I noticed my own breathing had become shallow. Somewhere behind me, leaves rustled. Not in the random way wind moves them. This was in bursts, like footsteps trying to stay quiet. I picked up my pace. My legs were starting to burn from the uneven ground, but I didn't dare stop. Every time I thought the sound had faded, I would hear it again closer. I broke into a jog, splashing through patches of mud, slipping on wet leaves. My mind was racing, trying to figure out how far I was from the main trail. I turned a corner in the path and nearly lost my balance on a slick route. The air seemed lighter here, and I caught a glimpse of the wider trail ahead. I pushed harder, lungs burning, until I reached it. Once I was back on the main trail, I didn't stop. I ran the rest of the way to the parking area, my shoes pounding the dirt, my arms pumping hard. When I finally saw my car, I fumbled with the keys and got inside, slamming the door and locking it. My chest was heaving, and sweat ran down my back despite the cool air outside. I sat there for a few minutes, gripping the steering wheel and listening. The forest was quiet again. No footsteps, no breathing, nothing but the faint whisper of wind through the trees. It was almost as if nothing had happened, but I knew it had. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw only the empty trail entrance. But in my mind, I could still hear those slow, deliberate breaths. I never went back to that trail again. Even now, years later, when I pass the turnoff that leads there, I feel that same prickle on my skin and remember how quickly the forest can go from peaceful to dangerous without warning. If I had stayed just a little longer, if I had hesitated instead of running, I'm not sure I'd be here to tell this story. It was already late in the afternoon when I decided to take the back trail that cut through the ridge. The day had been unusually warm for early autumn, the air thick and still, with no breeze moving through the dry leaves. I had been hiking since late morning, trying to cover as much ground as I could before dark. I had underestimated how long it would take to loop back to my car, and now I was pushing my luck with daylight. The sun had dropped low enough that the ridge ahead was already casting long shadows over the valley, and the light that did make it through was thin and fading. The trail was narrow, little more than a path worn by hunters and deer. On one side, the slope dropped sharply into a tangle of fallen branches and boulders. On the other side, it rose in a steep, rocky wall covered in dry moss and stunted trees. The air had grown cooler, but not in a pleasant way. It was the kind of cool that felt heavy, like it carried weight with it. I could hear my own footsteps crunching over the mix of dirt, loose rock, and dry leaves, every sound oddly sharp in the stillness. I had my pack strapped tight to my shoulders, but it felt heavier with each step. I hadn't seen another person for hours, not since I'd passed an older man with a fishing pole miles back near the stream. Out here, there were no signs, no benches, no trail markers, just the path and the silence. My legs were starting to ache, but what bothered me more was the growing sense that I needed to be back at my car before full dark. I told myself it was just because the trail was rough and remote, but deep down I knew there was something else, something I didn't want to name. As I came around a bend, I caught movement up ahead. At first, I thought it was a trick of the fading light, a shadow sliding across the ridge. But no, it was definitely a person, walking along the trail about 50 or 60 yards ahead. The figure was tall, dressed in dark clothing, and moving at a steady pace without looking back. I couldn't make out any details, just the shape and the rhythm of the steps. Something about the way they moved struck me as strange. It wasn't slow or casual, but it also wasn't hurried. It was deliberate, like they had somewhere to be and a reason to be there. I adjusted my pace, not wanting to get too close, but also not wanting to lose sight of them. The trail curved and dipped, and at times I lost them behind trees or turns, but each time I rounded the next bend, they were there again, just far enough ahead to be out of reach. They never glanced back, never shifted their stride, never showed any sign that they knew I was behind them. The silence felt heavier now, the kind that makes every sound you make seem louder than it should be. My breathing seemed too loud, my pack straps too creaky, my boots too heavy on the ground. The ridge flattened out after a while, the trees thinning enough that I could see across to the next slope. That's when I realized the figure had left the trail. I saw them stepping off onto a narrow side path that led toward a break in the ridge, where the land dropped away sharply. Without thinking, I slowed my pace. The side path wasn't one I had planned to take. It looked rough and overgrown, the kind of route used rarely and for specific reasons. I reached the spot where they had left the trail and glanced down it, but they were already gone, swallowed by the uneven ground and the cover of low brush. For a moment, I just stood there, catching my breath. I could feel the sun dropping lower, the shadows pulling longer across the slope. I thought about following the main trail, putting distance between myself and whatever that was, but curiosity mixed with a gnawing unease kept my feet rooted. Then, from somewhere far down the slope, I heard it, a dull, rhythmic thump. It wasn't loud, but in the stillness it carried. Thump. A pause. Thump. Then silence. I strained my ears, holding my breath, but nothing else came. I told myself it could have been anything, a branch falling, a rock shifting, but my gut wasn't convinced. I adjusted my pack and forced myself to keep moving. The light was dying fast now, and I could feel the temperature dropping with it. The trail narrowed again, forcing me to pick my steps carefully. Every so often, I thought I heard faint movement behind me, but each time I stopped to listen, there was nothing. The last stretch of the trail wound through a patch of thicker woods, where the canopy overhead blocked what little light was left. My eyes had to adjust, and I slowed down, stepping over roots and pushing through low branches. That's when I heard it again, movement, this time closer. It was a steady, careful sound, like someone placing each step deliberately to avoid making too much noise. My skin prickled. I didn't turn around. I just focused on keeping a steady pace, telling myself it was probably an animal. But the steps matched my rhythm, always just far enough back to stay out of sight. The woods felt tighter, the air thicker, my pulse louder in my ears. When I finally saw a faint break in the trees ahead, I felt a wave of relief. That break meant I was close to the gravel lot where I'd parked. I pushed forward, my steps quicker now. The sound behind me stopped. I reached the clearing and stepped out into the open, the last traces of daylight brushing the tops of the trees. My car was there, exactly where I'd left it, the metal faintly cool to the touch as I grabbed the handle. I opened the door, tossed my pack inside, and climbed in, locking the doors without thinking. I sat there for a moment, breathing hard, staring out through the windshield at the trailhead. The woods were still, the shadows deep. Nothing moved, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just beyond the trees, watching. I turned the key and started the engine, the sound loud in the quiet. As I backed out and pulled onto the narrow dirt road, I caught one last glimpse in the rearview mirror. Something dark standing just inside the tree line, tall and still. It didn't move. I didn't stop. I drove until the road met pavement, and even then I didn't slow down. By the time I reached the main highway, the last light was gone, and the woods were nothing but a dark wall in the distance. I never saw another person the rest of the drive home, and I didn't tell anyone what had happened. But for weeks afterward, I kept replaying it in my head, wondering who, or what, it had been, and why they had been walking that ridge with me in the dying light. I knew one thing for sure. I would never take that trail alone again. It had been one of those late summer evenings when the air felt heavy and thick, the kind that made every movement a little slower. The sun had just slipped below the horizon, leaving the sky painted in streaks of orange and purple that were quickly giving way to the deeper shades of night. I had gone out for a walk after dinner, something I did often to clear my head. The streets in my neighborhood were usually quiet at that hour, just the occasional car passing or the faint sound of a television from a nearby house. I didn't think twice about taking the longer route, the one that cut behind the industrial area where old warehouses stood with cracked walls and rusted fences. It was the kind of place most people ignored, a forgotten strip of land between the last houses and the train tracks. The air smelled faintly of oil and dust as I moved along the cracked pavement, the weeds on the edges tall enough to brush against my legs. A single street lamp flickered near the corner, casting uneven light that stretched shadows unnaturally long. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the faint hum of the highway, a low and constant backdrop to the night. It wasn't exactly a friendly place, but I had walked there before, and nothing had ever happened. I wasn't in a hurry, so I slowed my steps, letting my mind wander. That's when I noticed something. Far ahead, maybe 50 or 60 yards away, there was a shape in the middle of the road. At first, I thought it was a stray dog. The shape was low, hunched, but the longer I stared, the less it seemed like an animal. It didn't move the way a dog would. It didn't pace or sniff around. It was still, completely still. My footsteps echoed faintly off the warehouse walls, and for a moment, I thought maybe it was just a pile of discarded trash or a box someone had left. But the stillness felt intentional, like it was aware of me. I kept walking, telling myself not to overthink it. The closer I got, the clearer it became that it wasn't trash. It was a person. They were crouched low, arms wrapped around their knees, head lowered so their face wasn't visible. Something about the posture made me slow down. It wasn't the casual rest of someone waiting for a bus or tying their shoe. It was tight, contained, almost like they were bracing for something. The road here was narrow, fenced on both sides with no real way around unless I turned back. I didn't want to seem paranoid, but I also didn't want to get too close. I took a breath, kept my pace steady, and hoped they would just stay put and ignore me. But as soon as I reached the point where I was maybe 15 feet away, the person slowly lifted their head. The movement was deliberate, and in the dim light, I could barely make out the shape of their face. Their eyes locked onto mine immediately, unblinking. There was no expression, no anger, no smile, just a blank stare that seemed to stretch too long. Without a word, they rose to their feet. The way they stood up was unsettling, not rushed, but fluid, as if they had been expecting this moment. They didn't say anything, didn't step toward me, but they didn't move aside either. The space between us felt suddenly too small, the quiet of the street too loud. I decided to keep walking, forcing myself to pass within arm's length of them. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears as I moved by, eyes fixed forward. The moment I passed, I caught the faint sound of footsteps behind me. At first, they were slow, matching my pace exactly. I told myself it could be a coincidence. Maybe they were just heading in the same direction. But when I sped up, the footsteps sped up too. When I slowed, they slowed. I didn't dare turn around right away. I didn't want to make eye contact again. My hands felt clammy, and I could feel the heat rising in my chest. The road curved slightly, and I used that moment to glance back. They were closer now, no more than 10 feet behind me. Their arms hung loosely at their sides, shoulders slightly hunched forward, as if they were leaning into each step. That same blank stare was fixed on me, eyes unblinking even as we moved. The street lamp light caught their face just enough to show pale skin and sharp cheekbones, but no other details I could hold on to. I turned forward again, trying to think. There were no houses nearby, no open shops, just the warehouses, most of which were locked and dark at this hour. I knew there was an alley to the left a few blocks ahead, one that led back toward a busier road. If I could get there, maybe I could lose them. My pace quickened. The sound of their steps quickened too. I could hear the faint scrape of their shoes against the pavement, the steady rhythm matching mine perfectly. The alley came into view, narrow and poorly lit. I didn't hesitate. I turned sharply into it and immediately started running. My shoes slapped against the uneven concrete, the sound bouncing off the close walls. Behind me, the footsteps broke into a run as well. The echo made it hard to tell exactly how close they were, but it was close enough. I could feel the rush of adrenaline flooding through me, each breath sharp and fast. Halfway down the alley, I spotted a chain-link fence on the right with a section where the bottom had been pulled loose. Without thinking, I dove toward it, dropping to the ground and sliding under. The metal scraped against my back, and I could feel the dirt grind into my hands as I pushed through. I came up on the other side in a small lot overgrown with weeds. I stayed low, crouched behind a pile of old pallets, my breathing loud in my own ears. The running footsteps entered the alley. They didn't slow. I could hear them passing the spot where I had slipped under the fence, the sound growing fainter as they continued toward the other end. I waited, forcing myself to stay still until I was sure they were gone. Minutes passed, though it felt much longer. The only sound now was the faint hum of the city in the distance. When I finally stood, my legs felt weak. I made my way through the lot, found a side street, and walked quickly back toward the busier part of town. Every shadow felt too deep, every sound too sharp. I didn't look back again until I reached a well-lit main road with cars passing regularly. Only then did my breathing start to slow. I never saw that person again. I still don't know what they wanted or why they were there. But every time I walk now, I avoid that part of town completely. I can still remember the sound of their footsteps perfectly matching mine, the blank stare that didn't blink, and the slow, deliberate way they stood up as if they had been waiting for me all along. And I know, without any doubt, that if I hadn't run when I did, I might not have made it home at all. It had been a long week, and I wanted nothing more than to clear my head somewhere quiet. I had been working nonstop, my eyes glued to a screen for hours every day, and I needed a place with no noise, no phones, no interruptions. I remembered a small lake I'd seen years ago while driving through the countryside. It sat at the edge of a thick forest, far from any towns, and there was no official campsite, just a flat patch of ground near the water where you could set up a tent. I decided I'd go there for the weekend, just me, my tent, and the stillness of the woods. The drive took nearly 3 hours. The roads got narrower the farther I went, with the asphalt eventually giving way to gravel and then to dirt. There were no houses along the final stretch, only miles of fields and clusters of trees. The air felt different out here, heavier, quieter. Even my car seemed out of place, the engine's hum sounding too mechanical in such a still environment. When I finally reached the lake, I pulled up onto the patch of ground I remembered and stepped out. The silence was thick, broken only by the faint sound of water lapping at the shore. The lake was small, maybe 200 feet across, with dense pine trees ringing its edges on 3 sides. The 4th side opened into a field that sloped gently upward toward a ridge. Beyond that ridge, I couldn't see anything. The forest on the far side looked almost impenetrable, the kind of place you could get lost in after only a few minutes. I set up my tent about 10 feet from the water. The ground was dry, though I could see where the grass near the edge was flattened, as if deer came here often to drink. After setting up camp, I gathered some dry sticks for a fire. The sun was starting to sink, casting long shadows across the lake. The air was cool, the smell of pine and damp earth strong enough to notice with every breath. As the sun dipped lower, I lit the fire. The flames crackled softly, the smoke drifting upward in thin lines before vanishing into the night. I ate a simple meal, staring into the fire and letting my thoughts slow down. The stillness was comforting. It was around 9 when I noticed movement on the ridge. I was sitting by the fire, staring lazily toward the field, when I saw a dark figure moving steadily along the top of the hill. The distance was hard to judge in the fading light, but I guessed it was about 200 feet away. The figure wasn't rushing, just walking in a straight line parallel to the ridge. I couldn't make out any details, no clothes, no face, nothing but a moving silhouette against the dim sky. The person never stopped or looked my way. They kept the same pace until they disappeared down the far side of the ridge. I sat there for a while, watching the spot where they'd vanished, half expecting them to come back, but the ridge stayed empty. I told myself it was probably just someone from a nearby farm taking a shortcut, though I hadn't seen any houses for miles. The thought stayed with me, but I tried to push it aside. I stoked the fire, letting the flames grow higher, and after a while I decided to collect a little more wood before turning in. The forest just beyond the lake was dark, but not completely black. The moon had risen, casting pale light between the trees. I walked in about 20 feet, picking up a few fallen branches and stacking them in my arms. That was when I heard it, slow, heavy breathing behind me. It was close enough that it wasn't just an idea in my head. I could hear the deep pull of air in and the low push of air out, steady and deliberate. I froze, my body tensing so hard it felt like my muscles might snap. I turned my head slightly, my eyes scanning the spaces between the trees, but I didn't see a shape. Just faint movement, like something slipping behind a trunk as soon as I looked. The breathing shifted, growing fainter, moving away from me. Whatever it was heading deeper into the forest. I didn't chase it. I didn't even try to figure it out. My body moved on instinct, my legs carrying me back toward the glow of the fire, as fast as they could without breaking into a run. My chest felt tight, my hands gripping the branches so hard the bark dug into my palms. When I got back to camp, I dropped the wood next to the fire and crouched there, listening. The night was silent again. The stillness that had felt peaceful earlier now felt wrong, like it was holding its breath. I stayed up later than I planned, feeding the fire until the flames were strong and the heat pushed back the darkness. Eventually, exhaustion forced me into the tent. I lay in my sleeping bag, every small noise magnified, the creak of a branch, the faint rustle of grass. I barely slept. The next morning, the sky was pale blue, and the air was cold enough to make my breath visible. I stepped outside and scanned the ridge. Nothing. I made coffee over the fire, trying to shake the tension in my body. I told myself I was being paranoid. By afternoon, the sun had warmed the air, and I walked a slow loop around the lake. On the far side, near the base of the ridge, I found fresh footprints in the soft dirt. They were human bare, the toes clearly visible. The size looked too large to be mine. They led toward the trees and then stopped, as if the person had stepped onto the harder ground where no prints could form. I didn't like the feeling in my gut. That evening, I kept the fire going earlier, not wanting to be caught in the half-light like the night before. I stayed close to camp, never letting the ridge out of my sight. The sun went down, the moon came up, and the shadows stretched across the field. It was almost midnight when I saw movement again. The figure appeared on the ridge, walking in the same slow, steady way as before. This time, they stopped halfway across. I couldn't see their face, but I could feel the weight of their attention on me, even from that distance. They stood there for what felt like minutes, then slowly turned and walked down the far side again. I didn't sleep at all that night. My mind kept circling the same thought. Someone was watching me, and they knew I was alone. At first light, I packed up my tent and gear as quickly as I could. I kept looking at the ridge, half expecting to see the figure again, but it stayed empty. The forest was quiet, the lake still, as if nothing had happened. But as I loaded the last of my gear into the car, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. On the edge of the clearing, where the grass met the trees, there was a single bare footprint in the dirt, pointing toward my camp. It was fresh. I didn't linger. I got in the car, started the engine, and drove until the lake and the ridge were miles behind me. I've never gone back. Even now, I can't shake the thought that whoever, or whatever, they weren't just passing through. They were waiting, and the next time, they might not have kept their distance. It was late summer, the air still carrying that dry heat that lingers into the evening, but the sun had already dipped below the horizon. I had decided to drive out to a secluded fishing spot I knew about, a narrow lake tucked between low rolling hills and patches of thick brush. The road to get there was more of a dirt track than anything, winding through scrubland with barely enough room for one car. I had been there plenty of times before, always alone, and I liked it that way. It wasn't a tourist spot. No signs, no parking lot, no picnic benches. Just a dusty pull-off that you could easily miss if you weren't looking for it, and then a short walk down to the water. By the time I parked, the sky had gone from pale orange to deep blue. Crickets were starting up in the weeds, and the smell of the dry earth mixed with the faint scent of stagnant water from the lake below. I grabbed my small backpack and flashlight, even though I didn't plan on using it right away. The trail down to the water wasn't much, just a narrow dirt path lined with uneven rocks and patches of grass. The bushes on either side leaned in close, brushing against my arms as I walked. I could hear the lake before I saw it, the soft lapping of water against the muddy bank. There wasn't a single ripple from wind, just that slow movement from whatever fish swam beneath the surface. The air down there was cooler, carrying the faint damp smell of algae and wet reeds. I set my bag down near a patch of flat ground where I'd sat countless times before. The silence settled around me in a way that felt almost heavy, the kind where every small sound, my own footsteps, the rustle of my bag seemed sharper. The moon hadn't fully risen yet, so the water was just a dark mass in front of me. I took out my folding chair and set it up facing the lake, tossing a few stones into the water while I got comfortable. Each splash sounded louder than I expected. The hills around the lake created an echo, the sound bouncing faintly back. I noticed how still the air was. No wind through the reeds, no distant hum of insects from across the water. Just crickets behind me and the occasional faint splash somewhere far off. After sitting for a while, I realized how quiet it had really become. Even the crickets seemed to have gone still. It's something you notice in the outdoors, the way animals sometimes go silent all at once. Usually it's nothing, maybe a predator somewhere nearby, maybe just a shift in temperature. But when it happens, it always gets under your skin a little. I looked across the lake, my eyes adjusting to the dim light, but I couldn't see much beyond vague shapes of bushes and low trees hugging the shore. I thought I saw movement up on the far side, just where the hill rose steeply from the water. It was too far to make out details, just a darker shape against the slope. At first I figured it was a deer, or maybe a coyote passing through. The hills were full of them, but the shape kept moving steadily, not stopping to graze or sniff around. It was slow but deliberate, cutting across the slope until it disappeared into a patch of darker shadow where the trees thickened. I shrugged it off and went back to tossing stones, listening to the plunks fade into the still air. But a few minutes later, there was another sound, different this time. A faint, irregular crunching coming from my left, higher up the slope above the trail I'd come down. The sound stopped, then started again, closer than before. It wasn't the sound of a small animal in the brush. It was heavier, slower, like something was deliberately placing each step. I stayed seated, telling myself it was probably just another hiker or fisherman, though I knew how unlikely that was at this hour. Nobody came out here this late. I kept my eyes fixed in that direction, waiting for a shape to appear, but the slope was steep and shadowy, and nothing stood out. The crunching stopped. Silence again. After a while, I stood and stretched, thinking I might pack up early. I didn't like how quiet it felt now, like the whole place was holding its breath. I folded my chair and slid it into its bag, the sound of the fabric loud in the stillness. That's when I heard it again, this time behind me, closer to the trail I'd taken down. The same deliberate crunching of weight on dry grass and dirt. I froze, my backpack half-zipped. My first thought was that maybe someone had followed me down here, but I couldn't imagine why. I turned slowly, scanning the slope with my eyes. The beam of my flashlight cut through the shadows, lighting up patches of rock and brush, but nothing moved. I swept the light back and forth. Still nothing. I decided to head back to the car. I slung my bag over my shoulder and started up the narrow trail, the beam of my light bouncing over the uneven ground. The path felt longer than before, my own breathing sounding too loud in my ears. About halfway up, the beam caught something, an impression in the dirt just off the trail. It wasn't sharp enough to see clearly, but it was big, bigger than a boot. I didn't stop to study it. The crunching started again, somewhere to my right now, parallel to me on the slope. The sound matched my pace, speeding up when I sped up, slowing when I slowed. I didn't dare stop this time. My grip on the flashlight tightened, my heart thudding so hard it felt like it filled my chest. When I broke through the last line of brush at the top, my car was a pale shape in the dim light. I didn't look back. I fumbled my keys out of my pocket, dropped them once, snatched them up, and yanked the door open. The moment I slid inside and locked the doors, the crunching stopped. The silence pressed in again. I started the engine, the sound loud and almost comforting. As I pulled onto the dirt track, my headlights swept across the brush and the edge of the slope. For a brief second, I saw it, something low to the ground but broad, its head turning toward the light before it slipped back into shadow. It wasn't a deer. It wasn't a coyote. It moved like it had been following me the whole time, staying just out of sight. I didn't stop driving until I hit the main road miles away. The entire time, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see movement in the dust my tires kicked up. Even now, I don't know what it was. All I know is that it was smart enough to stay hidden, quiet enough to almost convince me I was imagining it, and close enough that I could hear every step it took alongside mine. When I think about it now, I don't picture the lake or the hills or the trail. I picture that last glimpse in my headlights, and the way it seemed to pause, not in surprise, but like it knew I was leaving and didn't care to follow anymore. Not tonight. It started out as a normal Saturday for me. I had woken up a little earlier than usual, not because I had plans, but because the sunlight had found a way through the gap in my curtains and landed right across my face. I got up slowly, my body still heavy from the late night before, and went through the usual routine, brushing my teeth, making coffee, scrolling through my phone without really reading anything. The air outside had that crisp, late autumn feel to it, where the wind carried just enough bite to remind you winter wasn't far off. I didn't have much to do that day, so I decided to take a long walk outside the city. There's a spot I like going to when I want to clear my head, an old trail that starts behind a set of abandoned train tracks and winds through a stretch of woods that eventually leads to an open field. It's not a hiking spot people talk about or visit often. In fact, I rarely saw anyone else there. The trees were thick and close together in some parts, their branches interlocking overhead like a ceiling. Once you got deep enough, the sound of cars, voices, and the rest of the city faded until all you could hear was your own breathing and the occasional rustle of leaves. I packed a small backpack, water, a snack, a flashlight, just in case. The weather was good for walking. Dry ground, no sign of rain, and a steady breeze. The train tracks looked the same as always when I got there. Rusted metal rails with weeds sprouting through the wooden ties, gravel scattered unevenly across them. I crossed over and stepped into the start of the trail. The first mile or so was easy going. My footsteps crunched softly over the dirt path, and the wind pushed against the tops of the trees, so they swayed and creaked. I could hear a woodpecker somewhere off to the left, tapping against a trunk in short bursts. Sunlight filtered in between branches, moving across the ground as the wind shifted them. Every so often, I'd stop to take in the smell of damp earth and fallen leaves. About 40 minutes in, the trail started to narrow. The trees pressed in closer, and the undergrowth thickened. I knew from past visits that this was the part where it got a little harder to move through, especially in the colder months when plants died back, but the fallen limbs cluttered the way. I pushed on, stepping over roots and ducking under low-hanging branches. It was quiet, so quiet that I noticed the difference immediately when I heard it. A steady crunching sound behind me. Slow, deliberate steps on dry leaves. I stopped, thinking maybe it was an animal. Deer were common here, sometimes even coyotes, though I had never seen them this far in during the day. I turned and scanned the path, but the trail curved back and hid the view. The sound stopped the moment I stopped. I stood still for a good 30 seconds, listening. All I heard was the wind again. I told myself it was probably just a branch falling or a squirrel moving through the leaves. I kept walking, this time paying closer attention to my surroundings. I made it about another 100 feet before the sound returned. Crunch, pause, always keeping a steady distance behind me. I didn't turn around this time. Instead, I quickened my pace, trying to make the steps blend in with the sound of my own. My heart was beating faster now, though I didn't want to admit I was spooked. I'd been on this trail plenty of times. I knew it well. But something about those footsteps, how they seemed to match my pace when I sped up, was wrong. After a few more minutes, I reached a fork in the trail. The left path kept going deeper into the woods toward the field. The right was a narrower, lesser-used way that looped back toward the tracks. Without much thought, I went right. My reasoning was simple. If someone was following me, I didn't want to lead them further into isolation. I'd head back toward the starting point. The right path was rougher, covered in fallen leaves that made the ground soft and uneven. It climbed slightly uphill, and I could feel the strain in my calves. I listened hard for the sound again, but couldn't tell if I heard it over the wind. Then, just as I was thinking maybe I'd imagined the whole thing, I caught a glimpse of something moving through the trees about 30 feet back. It wasn't clear, just a shape, partly hidden by branches. But it was upright. Too tall for a deer, too still for an animal. My chest tightened. I didn't stop walking, but I started to focus on each step, trying not to trip over roots while keeping a steady pace. My mouth was dry, and every nerve in my body felt like it was pulling me to run, but I knew if I broke into a sprint, I'd risk falling. The path narrowed again until I was practically brushing against bushes on both sides. I could hear my own breathing now, faster and louder. The movement behind me had stopped being careful. It sounded closer, more confident, like whoever it was didn't care if I knew they were there. I came to another bend and remembered that this trail looped back near the tracks in less than a mile. But a mile suddenly felt very far. I picked up the pace again. My legs burned. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but never caught more than a flicker of movement. At one point, I thought I heard breathing behind me, deep, steady breaths, not far off. I didn't dare turn around. My whole focus was on getting back to the open area near the tracks. The trees finally began to thin, and I could see brighter light ahead. When I stepped out from the tree line, the open sky above the tracks felt like relief. The trail met the gravel slope next to the rails, and I scrambled up to stand on them. I looked back into the woods. Nothing moved. The trees swayed, the branches whispered, but there was no sign of anyone. I stood there for a long minute, scanning the shadows between the trunks. Then, without really thinking, I started walking along the tracks toward the road. The gravel shifted under my boots, making every step slow and deliberate. I didn't look back again until I reached the point where the woods were fully behind me. When I did, I saw it. Just inside the tree line, half hidden by a trunk, was a figure. Tall, thin still. The distance between us made it impossible to see details. No face, no clothes I could make out, just a shape standing perfectly motionless. It didn't move toward me. It didn't step back. It just stood there as I turned and kept walking until the road came into view. Only when I was back on asphalt, with houses and cars in sight, did I let my shoulders drop and breathe fully again. I never went back to that trail after that day. Not because of what I saw exactly, but because of the way it felt, that slow, deliberate following, the knowledge that someone was matching my pace in a place where there shouldn't have been anyone else. It wasn't the sight of them that stayed with me, it was the sound, the steady crunch of leaves behind me, always there until I reached the edge. And even now, years later, I still hear it in my head if I walk alone in the woods too long. It was late September when I decided to spend a weekend alone in the mountains. I had taken a few solo trips before, but nothing that pushed me too far from comfort. This time, I wanted to go deeper, somewhere quiet and untouched, away from trails and campgrounds where I wouldn't see another person for days. I packed everything I thought I would need: a small tent, sleeping bag, food for 3 days, a map, compass, and a knife I'd carried for years. My backpack was heavy, but the weight felt good at the start, like it gave me a sense of control over what was ahead. The morning air was crisp, the kind that holds the last warmth of summer, but whispers about the cold that's coming. I parked my car on the edge of a dirt road that wound into the mountains. The forest here wasn't like the neat, manicured trails I'd seen before. This was wild country, dense pine trees, thick brush, and slopes that twisted away into the distance. As I walked deeper in, the road gave way to game trails. I could hear the faint rustle of wind pushing through the high branches and the occasional call of birds. The ground was uneven, covered in fallen needles, soft soil, and patches of moss. By midday, I'd climbed high enough that the air was cooler. My shirt stuck to my back with sweat, but I kept moving until I found a small clearing between a cluster of tall pines. It was flat enough to set up my tent, with just enough space for a fire pit. The trees formed a loose wall around the clearing, and beyond them, the forest dropped off into a deep slope. I could hear water faintly in the distance, a stream or river somewhere below. After setting up camp, I decided to follow the sound of the water. The path down was steep, the ground slick with pine needles, but I managed to make my way without slipping. The stream was narrow but fast, cutting through a bed of smooth rocks. I crouched down, letting the cold water run over my hands, and filled my bottle. I stayed there for a while, watching how the sunlight caught on the moving water. On the way back, I noticed something I hadn't seen before: a faint trail leading uphill, narrower than the game paths I'd been following. It was lined with bent grass and broken twigs, like something had passed through recently. I figured it could just be deer or elk, but something about it made me pause. The branches were snapped higher up, not low to the ground. Whatever had come through was tall. I told myself it was probably nothing and went back to camp. That evening, I cooked over the small fire I'd built. The forest around me shifted as the light faded, the trees going dark and the air cooling quickly. Night settled in heavy, with no moon to break the darkness. My fire cast a weak circle of light that barely reached the nearest trees. The forest sounded different now, quieter in some ways, but every small noise seemed louder. The snap of a twig somewhere in the distance made my ears strain. I crawled into my tent after putting out the fire. The cold had crept in by then, and I pulled my sleeping bag tight around me. For a while, I lay still, listening to the faint rustle of the wind through the treetops. Eventually, I drifted off. I don't know how long I'd been asleep when I woke to a sound. It was faint at first, almost blending with the night, but it grew clearer the more I listened. Slow, deliberate footsteps on the forest floor. Not the light, quick steps of a deer or the scuttle of small animals. This was heavier measured. The steps would come, then pause, as if whoever or whatever it was stopping to listen. I lay there frozen, barely breathing. The sound seemed to move around the clearing, staying just beyond the reach of where my fire had been. I couldn't see anything through the thin tent walls, just the vague darkness outside. My mind scrambled for explanations. Maybe a bear, maybe an elk, but the steps didn't sound like an animal wandering aimlessly. They had a pattern, a direction. Eventually, the sound faded, moving off into the trees. I stayed awake for hours after that, listening, until exhaustion pulled me under again. The next morning, I stepped out of the tent and looked around. The ground around the clearing looked undisturbed at first, but when I walked to the edge, I saw impressions in the soil, shallow, human-shaped prints. They weren't sharp enough to tell much, but they were too wide to be mine, and they came from the direction of that narrow trail I'd noticed the day before. I spent the day hiking further into the forest, trying to shake the unease from the night before. I followed the stream for a while, fished a little, and cooked my catch over the fire. But as the sun dipped low again, the feeling came back. I couldn't stop glancing at the tree line, half expecting to see someone standing there. That night, I decided to keep the fire burning longer. I sat near it, staring into the flames, listening. Hours passed, and just when I was starting to feel foolish for being so on edge, I heard it again, footsteps, from the same direction as before. I turned my head slowly, but the firelight didn't reach far enough. The steps stopped. The forest went dead quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold still. My skin prickled. I stayed sitting, my hand resting on the knife at my side. Minutes passed like that, each one stretching longer than it should. Then, the steps started again, slower this time, circling. I didn't move until they faded away completely. I couldn't sleep that night. Every sound outside made my pulse jump. By morning, I'd made up my mind to leave. I packed up quickly, not bothering to cook breakfast. As I stepped onto the path leading back to my car, I glanced toward that narrow trail again. Something caught my eye, a fresh set of footprints in the dirt, heading toward where I'd camped. They were deep, like whoever made them had been carrying weight. The hike back felt longer than it had coming in. Every snap of a branch made me turn my head. I kept imagining someone just out of sight, following at the same pace, keeping distance but never letting me out of their reach. When I finally reached my car, I tossed my pack inside and locked the doors before starting the engine. I drove without stopping until the forest was far behind me. Later, when I thought back on it, the thing that unsettled me most wasn't the footsteps or the prints. It was that whoever had been out there never once came close enough to be seen, never made a sound loud enough to reveal themselves. They could have approached my tent in the dark, and I might never have known until it was too late. The thought stayed with me, heavier than the pack I'd carried in, and it was enough to make me decide I wouldn't camp alone like that again. Even now, when I hear footsteps in the quiet, my mind goes back to that clearing in the pines, the cold air, and the slow sound of someone moving just out of sight. I never saw them, but I know they were there. It had been a long week at work, the kind that makes you want to get as far away from people and noise as possible. I didn't have any big plans, no group trip or family gathering, just the idea of getting out to somewhere quiet. I remembered a small, out-of-the-way lake I'd visited once years ago. It wasn't in any guidebook, and you couldn't drive all the way to it. You had to park on a dirt track and walk about a mile through mixed forest and scrub. The place had been peaceful back then, and I figured it would be the same now. I packed light, small tent, sleeping bag, a little camp stove, some food, water, and a change of clothes. I left my phone in my backpack, except for checking the GPS to make sure I was heading the right way. The sun was bright but not too hot, the kind of weather that makes the air smell sharp and clean, with a mix of pine and damp earth. The dirt road was narrow, weeds growing high along the edges, and I could tell from the lack of tire marks that not many people had been down it recently. When I reached the place where the road ended, I pulled my bag over my shoulders and set off on the footpath. It was narrow and overgrown in places, and the sound of my footsteps on the dry leaves seemed louder than normal. I crossed a shallow stream by stepping over slick rocks, then pushed through a patch of brambles that snagged at my pants. The trees grew taller and thicker the closer I got to the lake. When I finally stepped out of the shade, the water lay in front of me like glass. Not a ripple on it except where a dragonfly skimmed across. No signs of other campers, no trash, no flattened grass where a tent might have been, no footprints near the shore. It was perfect. I set up my tent near a clump of trees that gave a little shelter from the wind and boiled water for a cup of coffee. I spent the afternoon walking along the edge of the lake, looking at animal tracks in the mud, mostly deer, a few raccoons. I felt relaxed in a way I hadn't in months. As evening came, the air cooled quickly. I cooked a simple dinner, ate, and sat watching the light fade from the sky. The forest around the lake turned black, except for the pale reflection of the moon on the water. I could hear the occasional splash of a fish jumping and the rustle of leaves when the wind shifted. I wasn't tired yet, so I walked a short distance along the shore, letting my eyes adjust to the dim light. The night smelled like damp earth and pine sap. It was quiet, so quiet that when a stick snapped somewhere in the trees behind me, the sound felt sharp, like it cut through the stillness. I froze for a moment, listening. It could have been a deer. It probably was. The woods here were full of them. I waited another minute, heard nothing more, and kept walking. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the sound had been close. I turned back toward camp, deciding it was late enough to call it a night. As I approached my tent, I noticed something odd. The flap was open. I was sure I'd zipped it closed before leaving. My first thought was that the wind had pulled it loose, but my bag, which I'd left inside, had been shifted. Not dumped out, just moved a little. I checked it over. Nothing was missing. I told myself it might have been an animal nosing around, even though I didn't see any claw marks or chewing. I zipped it up again, made sure the bag was inside, and got into my sleeping bag. For a while, I lay listening to the faint sounds of the forest. I could hear small movements now and then, something rustling in the undergrowth, a splash in the water, the distant hoot of an owl. I dozed off, only to wake some time later to a faint, steady sound, like someone walking slowly through dry leaves. At first I thought it might be my imagination. I held my breath, listening harder. The sound would come for a few seconds, stop, then start again. It wasn't random. There was a rhythm to it, a pause, then another set of steps. It was coming from the direction of the path I had taken to get here. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The moonlight gave everything a pale, washed-out look. I couldn't see anyone, just the faint outline of the trees. The steps stopped completely. I kept looking, eyes straining to pick out movement. Then I heard a soft splash, like a foot in shallow water, not far down the shore. I stayed still for a long time, my skin prickling. Eventually I convinced myself it could have been an animal, maybe a raccoon, or even a deer coming to drink. Still, I didn't sleep well for the rest of the night. When dawn came, I got up and walked toward the spot where I thought I'd heard the splash. The mud near the shore had fresh footprints in it. Bare human footprints, pressed deep enough to show the toes clearly. They were heading along the shore, away from camp. They weren't mine. I hadn't been there barefoot. I stood there staring at them for longer than I should have, feeling that unsettled tightness in my stomach. I thought about packing up right then, but part of me wanted to believe it was nothing. Maybe someone else had been out here fishing early in the morning, and I just hadn't seen them. I stayed, but I kept my gear closer and more secure. The day passed uneventfully, and by evening I felt a little calmer. That night, the wind picked up, making the tent fabric flap softly. I was almost asleep when I heard it again. Slow footsteps, this time from the opposite side of camp, the side facing the deeper woods. The sound came closer, then stopped. I sat up in my sleeping bag, my heart thudding. I could hear faint breathing outside the tent, just on the other side of the thin fabric. Not the quick, shallow breaths of an animal, slow, deep, steady breaths, like someone trying to be quiet. I didn't move. After what felt like minutes, the breathing faded, replaced by the sound of steps moving away. I stayed awake until the first light of morning. When I stepped out, the ground around my tent had scuffed patches in the dirt, as if someone had been standing there. That was enough for me. I packed my things quickly, glancing at the trees every few seconds. On the walk back to my car, I kept feeling as if I was being followed, but I never saw anyone. The only sound was the crunch of my own boots on the path. When I reached the dirt road, I looked back once more at the tree line. Nothing moved, but the stillness felt heavy, like the forest was holding its breath. I got in the car, locked the doors, and drove until the trees thinned and the road widened. I never went back to that lake, and I don't camp alone anymore. Whatever was out there didn't need to chase me or threaten me. It was enough to know that, for 2 nights, I wasn't alone, and that someone barefoot and silent had been close enough to reach through the fabric of my tent if they wanted to. It was supposed to be an ordinary Saturday. I didn't have much planned, so I decided to go for a long walk outside of town. I liked taking these kinds of walks when I had the time, away from the main streets, away from the noise. The further I went, the quieter things became. The houses grew farther apart, the traffic disappeared, and the air started to feel different, cleaner, colder, with that faint smell of damp earth and leaves. I didn't have any destination in mind. I just kept walking, letting the road and my thoughts carry me. After about an hour, I found myself at the edge of an old dirt road I'd never taken before. It led into a patch of forest that seemed untouched, the trees growing close together, branches knitting into a canopy that let only thin strips of light through. The air was still, almost heavy, and I could hear nothing except the occasional rustle of dry leaves when the wind shifted. I don't know why I decided to go down that road. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was because it looked so forgotten. The path was narrow, uneven, with roots pushing up through the dirt in some places. The more I walked, the less I could hear from the world I came from. No cars, no distant hum of the town. Just the sound of my own footsteps and the dull thud of my heartbeat in my ears. The further I went, the more the trees seemed to crowd in on me. Their trunks grew thicker, the undergrowth denser, and the sunlight dimmer. The air turned damp and cool, almost clammy. The ground beneath my shoes was soft in places, as though the soil was holding moisture from rain that must have fallen days ago. I passed the occasional rotting log, each one covered in pale moss and crawling with tiny insects that darted back into crevices when they sensed movement. I walked for what must have been 20 minutes when I noticed something odd. The forest was too quiet. Even deep in the woods, you usually hear the sound of birds calling or insects buzzing. Here, there was nothing. The silence had a weight to it, making every step sound too loud, like I was disturbing something that didn't want to be disturbed. Then ahead of me, I saw an opening, a small clearing. I slowed as I approached, unsure why I felt the need to move quietly. The ground in the clearing was covered in flattened grass and patches of bare dirt. In the center, there was something, a large, weathered tarp stretched between four wooden poles. It wasn't a tent exactly, more like a makeshift shelter. One side had partially collapsed, and the tarp sagged, holding small puddles of collected rainwater. I stopped at the edge of the clearing, just far enough that I could look, but not close enough to disturb anything. My stomach tightened. There were things scattered around the shelter: an old metal cooking pot, a dented tin can, a single boot lying on its side. The boot looked newer than the rest of the items, its laces still intact, the rubber sole barely worn. The tarp swayed slightly in the breeze, and for a second, I thought I saw a movement underneath. My pulse quickened, but when I stared, nothing happened. I told myself it was just the fabric shifting in the wind. Still, I felt uneasy. I decided to walk around the clearing, keeping my distance, just to see if there was any sign of who had been there. On the far side, hidden in the grass, I found more items: an empty plastic water bottle, crushed almost flat, and a torn piece of blue fabric snagged on a branch. It looked like part of a shirt sleeve. I glanced back toward the shelter and felt a strange pull, like I was being watched. I turned to leave, telling myself there was no reason to be there, but something made me pause. I heard a sound, faint, muffled. It wasn't a voice exactly, but it wasn't a natural forest sound either. It was low and uneven, like the sound of someone breathing through their mouth after running. It came from the direction of the shelter. I stood still listening, my eyes fixed on the sagging tarp. The breathing seemed to get slower, quieter, until it stopped completely. The silence that followed was even heavier than before. My hands felt clammy, and I realized I was gripping the strap of my bag so tightly that my knuckles hurt. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the shelter, and didn't turn until I was almost at the path. When I finally forced myself to look away and focus on walking, I realized my steps were quicker now, almost hurried. The forest still gave no sound, no birds, no insects, just my footsteps crunching over the dirt and leaves. I kept walking until I reached a spot where the trees began to thin and more light reached the ground. I could see the sky through the branches now, pale and cloud-streaked. That's when I noticed another sound behind me. At first it was faint, like the echo of my own footsteps, but soon it became clear they were not matching mine exactly. Whoever, or whatever, was behind me was stepping when I wasn't. I didn't turn around right away. My heart was pounding so fast it made my chest ache. I kept walking, trying to keep my pace steady, but the steps behind me didn't fade. They stayed close, too close. Finally, I glanced over my shoulder. The path was empty. No one was there. My breath caught in my throat, and I quickened my pace. After another 50 feet, I looked again. Still nothing. But the sound, it was there, and now it seemed slightly to my left, in the trees. I reached the edge of the dirt road, where it met the main street out of town. Relief washed over me at the sight of the open space. But when I looked back one last time, I saw movement in the shadows between the trees. Just a flicker, like someone stepping back into cover. I didn't stop moving until I was well into town again, surrounded by the sound of cars and people. The noise felt almost overwhelming after that deep, unnatural silence. But even then, the feeling didn't leave me. That sense of being watched followed. That night, I kept thinking about the shelter. Who had built it? Why was it so far into the woods, where barely anyone would find it? And why had there been fresh items among the old ones? I thought about the breathing, the faint footsteps, the movement in the trees. The next day, I told myself I wouldn't go back, that there was no reason to. But by evening, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I went back to the start of the dirt road, but something was different. There were fresh tracks in the mud, boot prints, larger than mine, going in and out of the forest. They weren't there yesterday. I turned around and left, this time without hesitation. I never walked that way again, but every time I pass that stretch of road, I can't help but glance at the tree line, half expecting to see someone standing just inside, watching. And in the weeks that followed, I started noticing small things. A boot print in the dirt near my own street, the feeling of someone walking behind me at night, the faint sound of slow breathing when I was alone in my apartment. Nothing I could ever prove, but enough to know that whatever was out there in those woods hadn't stayed there. It was supposed to be a normal trip. I had taken a few days off from work and decided to drive out to a quiet, rural area a couple of hours from the city. I wanted to get away from the constant noise, the phone notifications, the people. I rented a small, weathered cabin that sat back off a narrow dirt road, surrounded by thick woods. The pictures online made it seem peaceful, maybe even charming in a rugged way. The reality was that it was isolated. The nearest house was a good mile away, and there was no cell signal once I drove down into the hollow where the cabin sat. The drive there was uneventful, but the dirt road leading to the place felt longer than I expected. It narrowed quickly, trees pressing close on either side, their branches arching over and blotting out most of the sky. The light dimmed even though it was only late afternoon. My tires crunched over loose gravel, and occasionally I had to ease around deep potholes that looked like they had been there for years. The air felt heavy and still when I finally parked in the small clearing in front of the cabin. No wind, no distant hum of traffic, nothing but the faint rustle of leaves high up in the trees and the sound of my own footsteps on the wooden porch. Inside, the cabin was simple, just a main room with a bed pushed against the wall, a small kitchen area with an old electric stove and a single bathroom. The wood floor creaked under my weight, and I noticed the faint smell of dampness that always seems to cling to places that sit closed up for long periods. I unpacked slowly, keeping the door open to let in some fresh air. The view from the porch was nothing but trees, the slope of the land falling away into thicker forest. As the sun began to drop, the air cooled quickly. I made some food on the little stove and ate at the small table, looking out the window toward the tree line. It was strange how quickly the forest became shadowed, how the details blurred into dark shapes as the light faded. The quiet was deep, broken only now and then by the distant crack of a branch or the muffled call of some birds settling in for the night. I didn't plan on doing much that first evening, just relax and read a bit, but the stillness was hard to get used to. Every sound felt amplified. The groan of the cabin's old beams, the occasional rattle from the kitchen as the cooling night air shifted the wood. I told myself it was just a matter of adjusting, but I caught myself glancing out the window more than once, scanning the tree line without knowing exactly what I was looking for. By the time I decided to go to bed, the darkness outside the windows was absolute. Without streetlights or moonlight breaking through the clouds, it was the kind of black that seemed to press up against the glass. I left one small lamp on near the bed, telling myself it was just to make the place feel warmer. Somewhere in the night, I woke up. At first, I thought it was the wind, but there was no movement of air, no rustle through the trees. I lay still, listening, my eyes adjusting to the dim light from the lamp. That's when I heard it, a faint, deliberate crunching sound outside. It was spaced apart, slow, like someone stepping on leaves or gravel, then pausing. My mind went immediately to the clearing around the cabin. There wasn't much to step on except the gravel driveway and the patch of weeds that had grown up along the edge. The sound came again, closer this time. My stomach tightened. There was no reason for anyone to be here. I'd seen no other cars on the road when I arrived, and this cabin wasn't the type of place people just happened to walk past. I stayed still for several minutes, barely breathing, just listening. The steps stopped, replaced by silence so thick that I could hear the faint hum of the old refrigerator in the kitchen. I told myself it could have been an animal, a deer maybe, but the rhythm had been wrong. Too heavy, too deliberate. I didn't sleep much after that. Every time I drifted close to sleep, some small noise, real or imagined, jolted me back awake. By the time morning light seeped weakly through the curtains, my nerves were frayed. Stepping outside, I scanned the clearing. At first, everything looked the same. The gravel, the porch steps, the outline of the woods. Then I saw them, prints. Not boots, not sneakers, but the flattened, elongated shapes of someone's shoe tread pressed into the gravel, leading from the edge of the trees toward the side of the cabin. They stopped just short of the window nearest the bed. I crouched down, tracing the impressions with my eyes. They were clear enough that I could see the pattern in the sole, but they didn't lead away in the same direction. The return prints were lighter, harder to see, as if whoever it was had stepped more carefully going back. I spent most of that day trying to convince myself it wasn't a big deal. Maybe it was someone from the nearest property cutting through the woods for some reason. Still, I found myself glancing toward the tree-line constantly. The feeling that I was being watched clung to me all day. That night, I locked every door and window and kept the lights on. I sat on the couch with my back to the wall, reading without really taking in the words. The forest outside seemed even quieter than before, the silence almost unnatural. Hours passed without incident, and I finally started to think maybe it had been a one-time thing. Then, just past midnight, the sound came again. Slow steps in the gravel, moving toward the cabin. This time, they didn't stop at the window. I could hear them moving along the wall, the faint scuff of a shoe against wood. My chest tightened, and I felt the rush of cold adrenaline through my body. I strained to hear, every muscle tense. The steps paused, then resumed, so close I could almost sense the presence through the wall. I stayed completely still, barely even daring to breathe. After what felt like minutes, the steps moved away, fading into the distance until there was nothing but silence again. The rest of the night passed without more noise, but I didn't sleep at all. When morning came, I checked again. More prints. This time, they circled the cabin, as if someone had walked the whole perimeter. I made my decision quickly. I wasn't staying another night. I packed my things fast, loading the car with glances over my shoulder toward the woods. As I drove out along the narrow dirt road, the sense of being watched didn't leave. It stayed with me until I hit the main road and finally got a cell signal. Later, I told a few people about it, leaving out some of the details, but I never found out who it was or why they were there. All I know is that those woods and that cabin felt different after that. Not just quiet, but hollow, like the air itself was holding its breath. I still think about those prints sometimes, and how they stopped outside my window in the middle of the night. Even now, I can still remember the sound, those slow, careful steps in the gravel coming closer. It started in the late afternoon, the kind of day where the sun feels weaker than it should for the time of year. I had been driving for hours on a narrow two-lane road that cut through miles of farmland and low hills. My GPS had lost signal an hour earlier, and my phone barely clung to a single bar of service. I told myself I'd be fine. I wasn't too far from my destination, and even if I got a little lost, I could figure it out. But the road I was on seemed endless, with no gas stations, no houses close to the road, and no other cars passing me for a long stretch. I started noticing the sky dimming faster than I expected, like the day was being squeezed out of the world ahead of schedule. By the time the sun slid behind the hills, the temperature dropped sharply. I glanced at the clock and realized it was only a little after 6, but the shadows were long and the air had that evening bite to it. I decided I'd keep driving until I found somewhere to stop. That was when I noticed a small dirt turnoff, barely wide enough for a single car, branching off to the right. It wasn't on any map I remembered seeing. At first, I drove right past it, but something in my gut told me I should turn around and take it. Maybe it led to a small town, or at least to somewhere with lights and people. The dirt road began as a gentle slope but quickly narrowed, the grass and weeds growing taller along the edges. Branches from overhanging trees reached out toward the center, scraping against my car in slow, hollow drags. The sound made me tense, but I kept going. The road bent to the left, then to the right, winding deeper into what looked like a heavily wooded area. The further I drove, the less it felt like anyone had been through here in a long time. There were no tire tracks in the dirt, no signs of human presence. My headlights caught shapes between the trees, fallen branches, thick undergrowth, once even the reflective glint of two small eyes before they blinked and vanished. The deeper I went, the more the road degraded. Potholes appeared, some wide enough that I had to slow to a crawl to avoid bottoming out. The air grew colder, and my dashboard clock seemed to tick faster than it should have. I kept glancing behind me at the growing darkness swallowing the road I had come from, telling myself I could turn around at the next clear space. But the road never widened enough for that, and the thought of reversing all the way out through the winding dirt path made me uneasy. So I kept moving forward, inching deeper into the woods. Eventually, I saw an opening ahead where the trees thinned, and the dirt road leveled out into a wide, flat area covered in gravel and dead leaves. I pulled into it and turned off the engine. The sudden silence was heavier than I expected. No crickets, no wind, just the faint creak of trees shifting. My headlights lit up the far edge of the clearing, where an old wooden shack sat hunched in the shadows. Its roof sagged in the middle, and the boards on the walls were warped and split. It looked abandoned, at least. I wanted to believe it was. I didn't plan to get out. My idea was to turn around here and head back to the main road before it got completely dark. But when I put the car in reverse and looked over my shoulder, I froze. The dirt road behind me was gone. I could still see the gap in the trees where I had entered, but now it was blocked by a fallen tree trunk, thick and long enough that there was no way I could drive over or around it without damaging the car. I hadn't heard it fall. I hadn't heard anything at all. My chest tightened, and I gripped the steering wheel harder than I meant to. I thought about getting out and trying to move it, but even from inside the car, I could see it was too heavy. It would take more than one person to shift something like that, and I was alone. The only other option was to keep going past the shack and hope the road eventually led somewhere else. I didn't like the idea of passing so close to it, but I didn't see another choice. I started the car again and crept forward, my headlights sweeping across the front of the shack as I passed. Up close, I noticed details I hadn't seen before. The door was slightly open, its hinges rusted, and a single, rotting chair sat on the small porch. On the ground beneath it, a scattering of objects, empty bottles, a dented metal bucket, scraps of fabric, looked like they had been there for years. But what made my skin crawl was the faint impression in the dirt, right in front of the door. A single shoe print, sharp enough in detail to be recent. It was larger than my own foot, and deep, like the person had been standing there for a while. I kept driving, forcing myself to look straight ahead as I passed. The gravel turned back into dirt, and the road began to climb slightly. The trees here were even denser, their trunks packed so tightly that my headlights barely reached between them. I had been driving for maybe 10 minutes when something flashed across the road ahead. Too fast for me to make out clearly, but tall enough that it wasn't a deer. I hit the brakes, my tires crunching in the dirt, and stared into the shadows. The space between the trees was empty, but the feeling of being watched came over me so sharply that the hair on the back of my neck rose. I pressed on, though my speed dropped without me meaning it to. My eyes kept darting to the edges of the road, expecting to see movement again. At one point, I thought I saw a shape pacing me just inside the tree line, matching my speed, but every time I turned my head fully, it was gone. My hands were sweating, and my foot hovered close to the brake. I told myself that maybe it was just my nerves, that shadows and branches could play tricks on you in the headlights. The road eventually started sloping downward, the incline steeper than before. My headlights hit something pale ahead, and I slowed again. It was another fallen tree, smaller than the first but still too big to drive over without risking damage. This one was different, though. It looked cut, the edges too clean to be from a natural fall. The bark around the ends was stripped, fresh wood exposed. My stomach dropped as I realized how recent it must have been. I sat there, engine idling, staring at the barrier. My options were shrinking fast. Going back meant passing the shack again, and the idea of stopping in front of it in the dark made my skin crawl. But sitting here wasn't safe either. I glanced into the side mirror and froze. For a split second, I thought I saw a movement behind me on the road, a figure maybe, but it was too dark and far to be sure. I blinked, looked again, and it was gone. The emptiness behind me felt heavier now. My breathing grew shallow. I decided I wasn't staying in the car any longer. If I could climb over the smaller tree and follow the road on foot, maybe I'd find help faster than just sitting there. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove box, stepped out, and the cold air hit me like a slap. The ground was soft under my boots, each step sinking slightly into the damp dirt. I kept the flashlight beam low, scanning for roots or rocks, but I couldn't help sweeping it toward the trees every few seconds. That was when I saw it. About 20 feet into the woods, something stood between two trees, still as stone. The beam caught just enough to show the outline of a person, tall, broad-shouldered, facing me. I couldn't see a face, but I knew they were watching. My throat tightened, and I stepped backward toward the car without taking my eyes off the spot. But when I swept the light across it again, it was empty. I didn't run at first. I moved as quickly as I could without turning my back completely, but halfway to the car, I heard it. Footsteps. Not quick, not frantic, steady, deliberate, following me. The crunch of dirt under each step was louder than my own heartbeat. I yanked the car door open, slid inside, and locked it in one motion. My hands shook as I started the engine and threw it into reverse, not caring if I scraped the sides on branches as I backed away from the blocked path. I didn't stop until the shack came into view again, its dark shape looming at the edge of my headlights. I slowed, scanning the porch. The chair was empty, but the shack's door was no longer open. It was wide open, the black space inside swallowing the light. My chest felt tight enough to crack, but I kept moving, not daring to slow enough to look longer. I followed the road back toward where the first fallen tree had been, praying that somehow it would be gone. When I reached the spot, my heart sank. The tree was still there. I sat there for a moment, headlights on the barrier, my mind racing. Then I noticed something new. In the dirt, just beyond the trunk, were more footprints. Fresh ones, larger than before, leading from the woods to the road, circling the tree, then vanishing into the shadows on the other side. I didn't wait to see if they came back. I put the car in park, grabbed my flashlight again, and climbed out. The air felt even colder now, every sound amplified, the rustle of leaves, the occasional creak of wood somewhere deep in the trees. I climbed over the fallen trunk as quickly as I could, slipping once when my boot caught on the bark. On the other side, I forced myself to keep walking, following the faint outline of the road in the darkness. My breath puffed out in white clouds, and the beam of the flashlight trembled slightly in my grip. After what felt like forever, the road began to widen, the trees thinning. I could see the faint glow of something ahead, streetlights, maybe, or headlights from a distant highway. Relief began to creep in, but I didn't slow down. I kept walking until I stepped onto paved road again, the hum of distant traffic reaching my ears. Only then did I turn around. The dirt road behind me was nothing but blackness between the trees, my flashlight beam swallowed after only a few feet. I stood there for a long moment, listening. Nothing moved, but I couldn't shake the feeling that if I waited too long, I'd see something stepping into view from that darkness, watching me again. I didn't wait to find out. I turned and walked toward the glow ahead, my legs aching but my pace steady. I didn't look back again, but the feeling of eyes on me followed until the first cars passed, their lights breaking the grip of the woods. It was only then It was supposed to be a simple walk home. The sun had already dropped behind the horizon, and the air carried that heavy stillness that comes right after dusk, when everything feels like it's holding its breath. I had stayed later than I should have at a friend's place, and now the only way home was the path that cut through the wooded area behind the neighborhood. It wasn't deep forest, but it was thick enough that once you were in, the houses vanished from sight and the road was far away. I'd walked this way hundreds of times before in daylight, but at night it felt like an entirely different place, colder, darker, and much too quiet. The path started at a narrow break between two back fences. It was just dirt, worn smooth from years of kids riding bikes through it, and in the dark it looked like a tunnel into the trees. I stepped inside and almost immediately felt the air change. The warmth from the day was gone, replaced by a damp chill that clung to my skin. The smell of earth and rotting leaves hung in the air. My footsteps sounded louder than I expected, each one crunching on gravel and snapping twigs. I noticed how the sound didn't seem to carry far, just faded quickly into the dark around me, like the trees were swallowing it. The first stretch was about 50 yards straight in, and then it curved to the left where the trees grew thicker. I could still see the last bits of twilight through the branches overhead, but they were fading fast. The deeper I went, the more I felt the ground under me turn soft and uneven, roots jutting out and catching at my shoes. Somewhere ahead, I could hear a slow, rhythmic dripping, like water falling from a branch onto a pile of leaves. It was strangely loud, the kind of sound you wouldn't notice during the day, but that seemed amplified at night. As I walked, I became aware of something else. There was no wind at all. The branches weren't moving, and the leaves didn't rustle. Even the usual nighttime sounds, crickets and distant barking dogs, seemed absent. It was just the sound of my own footsteps, and that faint dripping ahead. I kept walking, telling myself not to overthink it, but I started glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. The darkness behind me looked thicker than the darkness ahead, as if it were closing in. I rounded the bend in the path and realized that I could no longer see the faint glow from the streetlights behind me. Now, it was just blackness pressing in from all sides. I could barely make out the outline of the trail ahead, just enough to keep walking without stumbling too much. That's when I heard it, another set of footsteps. Light, deliberate, coming from somewhere behind me. They weren't in sync with mine, and every time I stopped to listen, they stopped too. My ears strained in the silence, trying to pick them out again, but there was nothing except my own breathing and the drip, drip, drip ahead. I told myself it was probably an animal. This area had stray cats, raccoons, even the occasional fox. But I couldn't shake the feeling that these steps sounded too human, too careful. I started walking again, a little faster now, trying to keep my pace steady so it wouldn't look like I was hurrying. My heart was beating harder than I wanted it to, and my mouth felt dry. I could feel a bead of sweat forming at my temple despite the cold air. The path widened slightly ahead, opening into a small clearing where a power line cut through the trees. The ground here was a mix of gravel and hard-packed dirt, easier to walk on, but the openness made me feel exposed. I stopped for a moment, looking down the power line's narrow cut. It stretched away in both directions, disappearing into darkness. For a second, I considered leaving the path and walking along it to the road, but it was overgrown with tall grass and brush. I stayed where I was, straining to hear anything behind me. That's when I caught it again, footsteps, this time quicker, like whoever it was had closed some of the distance. They stopped almost as soon as I noticed them. I turned, staring back into the black tunnel I had just walked through, but I couldn't see a thing. The shadows between the trees were too dense. My stomach felt tight, my body tense and ready to move. I didn't want to run yet. I was afraid that would turn whatever was following me into a chase. I forced myself forward, back into the trees. The path narrowed again, and the darkness felt heavier now, pressing down on my shoulders. My ears kept picking up tiny sounds, a twig snapping, leaves shifting, but they came from different spots each time, like whoever was out there was moving in a wide arc around me. I tried to tell myself it was still just animals, maybe more than one, but deep down I knew it wasn't. There was a rhythm to the movements, a patience that felt intentional. Up ahead, I knew the path would cross a shallow creek. It wasn't wide, maybe 3 feet across, with flat stones you could step on to get over. I focused on that spot, telling myself that once I crossed it, I'd be close to the neighborhood again. The sound of the water reached me before I saw it, a quiet trickle that should have been comforting, but somehow wasn't. As I stepped closer, I noticed the smell of wet mud and something else, something faint but sharp, like rust or old blood. I bent down, using my hand to steady myself as I stepped onto the first stone. The creek was barely moving, just enough to reflect a dull shimmer of moonlight through the trees. I crossed quickly, my shoes slipping slightly on the damp rock, and stepped back onto the dirt path. The moment I did, I heard a splash behind me. Not a rock slipping into the water, but something heavy stepping directly into the creek. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up. Slowly, I turned my head just enough to look over my shoulder. I couldn't see much, just the faint outline of the creek and the shadows crowding around it. But I knew something was there. I couldn't explain how I knew, but I felt it, someone standing just far enough back to be hidden, watching me. My skin prickled, and I realized my breathing had gone shallow and quick. Without thinking, I started walking again, faster this time, my feet crunching through the gravel and dirt. My arms felt tense and awkward at my sides, like I didn't know what to do with them. The path began to slope upward, and I could feel my legs burning as I pushed myself to move faster. The trees here were closer together, their branches arching overhead so tightly that I could barely see the sky. I risked one glance back and instantly regretted it. For a split second, I saw a darker shape against the darkness, tall and still, standing where I had just been. It didn't move, but I could feel its attention on me like a weight pressing between my shoulder blades. I kept going, nearly jogging now, my shoes catching on roots and rocks. My lungs burned, and I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. I knew the end of the path was close, maybe 200 feet away, where it would open up to the street behind my neighborhood. I thought about sprinting, but I was afraid that if I tripped, I wouldn't have time to get up before whoever, or whatever, it was reached me. The path curved one last time, and I saw the faint orange glow of a streetlight ahead. Relief surged through me, but I didn't slow down. I kept my eyes locked on that light, moving as fast as I could without breaking into a full run. Behind me, I thought I heard another quick set of steps, but I didn't turn around. I reached the end of the path and stepped out into the open, the sudden brightness of the streetlight almost blinding me. I stood there for a moment, trying to catch my breath, my chest heaving. When I finally turned back toward the path, it was empty. Just a dark tunnel of trees leading back into the woods. I stood there for another minute, my ears straining, but there was nothing. No movement, no sound. Still, I knew I hadn't imagined it. Something had been in there with me, keeping pace, staying just out of sight. I walked the rest of the way home without looking back again. That night, I locked every door and window in the house before going to bed. Even though I was inside, the feeling stayed with me, the sense of being watched, of someone waiting just beyond the edge of the light. I didn't take that path again after dark. And every time I pass the entrance now, I can't help but think about the shape I saw standing in the shadows, completely still, as if it knew I'd be back one day. But I won't. It started as a simple plan, nothing dramatic. I had been feeling restless for weeks, buried under work and routine. So when I got a weekend off, I decided to get out of the city and spend a couple of days somewhere quiet. I found a small, rundown cabin listed online, tucked deep in the countryside and far from anything busy. The pictures showed peeling paint, an overgrown yard, and a small creek running at the edge of the property. It wasn't pretty, but that was the point. I didn't want charm or tourist appeal. I wanted silence. The idea of sitting on a porch with nothing but the sound of wind and water appealed to me. The drive out there took almost 4 hours. The last stretch was just dirt roads and scattered farms. The air felt different, heavy with the scent of damp earth and grass. It had rained earlier that morning, so the road was soft, the car slipping slightly in the mud in some parts. I saw fewer and fewer houses until there were none at all, just rolling hills, patches of trees, and fences marking forgotten boundaries. Eventually, the GPS lost signal, and I had to rely on the written directions I'd printed out before leaving. The last turn was onto a narrow path between tall weeds, the ground uneven and wet. It scraped the bottom of my car more than once before opening into a small clearing. The cabin stood in the center of it, weathered wood darkened by age and rain, the windows streaked and dull. The yard was wild, grass waist-high in some areas, thickets of weeds around the edges. The only sound was the creek somewhere beyond the trees. There was no sign of anyone else for miles. I killed the engine and sat there for a moment, letting the quiet settle around me. Inside, the cabin was exactly what I expected: dust, cobwebs in corners, and the faint smell of damp wood. The furniture was mismatched and old. A couple of chairs with sunken cushions, a table scarred from years of use, and a narrow bed in the single bedroom. There was no electricity and no running water inside, just a hand pump outside near the creek for drawing water. It felt like stepping back decades in time. I unpacked what I needed, lit a couple of candles, and opened the windows to let fresh air push out the mustiness. The first few hours passed quietly. I walked the property, following the creek until it wound back into dense trees, the water moving slowly over smooth stones. The ground was soft from the rain, my shoes leaving deep prints. I noticed animal tracks here and there, deer mostly, some smaller ones I couldn't identify. As the sun dipped lower, the air grew cooler. By the time I made it back to the cabin, shadows had stretched long over the clearing, That night, I built a small fire in the stone pit outside and sat there for hours, watching the flames. The dark here felt different than in the city. It wasn't just the absence of light, it was thicker, heavier, pressing in on all sides. Every small sound stood out: the crack of branches in the distance, the occasional splash in the creek, the faint rustle of grass as something moved through it. I couldn't see far beyond the firelight, and that alone made me feel exposed. By midnight, the cold had crept in enough that I put the fire out and went inside. The cabin was colder than I expected. I crawled into bed fully dressed, listening to the faint creak of the old walls in the wind. At some point in the night, I woke up to a noise, dull and heavy, like something thudding against the wall outside. I lay still listening. It came again, irregular, sometimes soft, sometimes louder. I told myself it was probably a branch knocking in the wind, but the sound was too low for that, too deliberate. I stayed awake until it faded, not sure when I finally drifted back to sleep. The next morning was gray, the sky thick with clouds. The air smelled sharp and wet, promising more rain. I stepped outside and circled the cabin, looking for the source of the sound from the night before. Near the back wall, the ground was freshly disturbed, mud churned and flattened, like something had been there for a while. There were prints too, not clear enough to make out exactly, but larger than my own foot. I crouched down, touching the wet earth. Whatever made them had been heavy. I told myself it was probably just a deer, maybe rooting around for food. I tried not to think too much about it, but the unease lingered. I spent most of the day indoors, reading, cooking over the small camp stove I'd brought, and trying to ignore the strange feeling of being watched whenever I stepped outside. The woods around the clearing looked thicker than they had the day before, the tree line darker, like it held something inside. That evening, I decided to walk to the creek again. The light was dim, the water darker under the shadow of the trees. The air was completely still, no wind, no rustling leaves, no bird calls. I stood there for a while, looking into the water, and noticed movement on the opposite bank. It was quick, low to the ground, slipping between the undergrowth. I couldn't see clearly, just a shape, but it moved with purpose, not like an animal foraging. I watched until it vanished deeper into the trees. On the walk back, I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling like something was behind me. My pace quickened, my heartbeat matching it. The clearing felt like safety when I finally saw it, but the cabin didn't feel as comforting as it had before. That night, the noise returned, closer this time. It wasn't just a thud against the wall now. There were soft, dragging sounds, like something moving slowly around the cabin. The wood creaked under weight near the porch. I lay still in bed, my breathing shallow, the blankets pulled up to my chin. Every instinct told me not to move, not to make a sound. After what felt like hours, it went quiet again, but I didn't sleep. By morning, I was exhausted. I walked the perimeter again and found more disturbed ground. Mud pressed down in wide, uneven shapes. The grass was bent in a trail leading toward the trees, but it stopped abruptly, as if whatever had made it had stepped off deliberately to hide its path. I decided I would leave early the next morning. The trip had stopped feeling like an escape and started feeling like something else entirely, like I was waiting for something I didn't want to meet. That evening, I didn't go outside at all. I locked the door, such as it was, and sat at the table with a candle burning, listening. The first sound was faint, a light scrape along the wall. Then another, closer to the window. The glass rattled softly, like it was being tested. My mouth went dry, my pulse hammering in my ears. The candle flame trembled in the draft. I sat there, unmoving, every muscle tense, listening to the slow, deliberate movement outside. When it reached the door, I felt the wood shift under a push. The latch held, but only barely. It wasn't built for strength. There was no knock, no voice, just the pressure, then a long pause. My hands were shaking. After a while, the weight lifted, and I heard slow steps moving away into the grass. I didn't move until the first pale light of dawn crept through the window. I packed quickly, my hands clumsy from lack of sleep. Outside, the yard was damp with dew, the grass shining in the low light. Near the edge of the clearing, I saw it, prints in the mud deep and wide, leading toward the trees. They weren't the neat, even marks of an animal. The stride was long, the shape irregular, like a bare foot, but wrong somehow, the toes spread too far apart. I didn't follow them. I didn't look toward the trees. I loaded my things into the car, started the engine, and drove until the dirt road turned back to pavement, and the trees thinned into open land. I didn't stop until I reached the first small town miles away. Even now, I think about those prints, about the quiet steps in the grass and the weight against the door. I tell myself it was just a person, someone passing through the woods who decided to test the cabin out of curiosity. But the shape of those tracks and the deliberate way they moved around the clearing still sit in the back of my mind. I didn't see their face, didn't hear a single word, and maybe that's why it unsettles me so deeply. Because whatever it was, it never needed to be seen or heard to make its presence known. And I know, without a doubt, that if I had stayed one more night, the door wouldn't have been enough to keep it out.